Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because the crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of my car at the trailhead. It was early September, and the Colorado Rockies were alive with the vibrant colors of early autumn. I, Sarah Green, had been looking forward to this solo hiking trip for months. As a 32-year-old software engineer from Denver, I craved these moments of solitude in nature to recharge from the chaos of city life. I shouldered my backpack, heavy with supplies for a weekend in the wilderness. The weight was comforting, a reminder that I was prepared for whatever the mountains might throw at me. Or so I thought. "You sure you don't want company, miss?" A gruff voice called out. I turned to see an older man in a park ranger uniform, his weathered face creased with concern. I smiled, used to the skepticism my solo trips often garnered. "I appreciate the concern, but I've done this trail before. I'll be fine." He nodded, though his eyes still held a hint of worry. "Well, just be careful out there. We've had some strange reports lately. Probably just the usual bear activity, but you never know in these parts." A small shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. "I'll keep my eyes open. Thanks for the heads up." As I set off down the trail, the ranger's warning echoed in my mind. But with each step into the forest, my worries melted away. The path wound through towering pines and aspens, their leaves a patchwork of green and gold. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional call of a bird high in the canopy. By midday, I had covered a good 6 miles. I paused in a small clearing to catch my breath and have a quick lunch. As I sat on a fallen log, munching on my trail mix, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest had grown unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Get it together, Sarah," I muttered to myself, packing up my food. "You're letting that ranger get in your head." I pushed on, determined to reach my planned campsite before dusk. The trail grew steeper, and I found myself breathing heavily as I climbed. That's when I heard it. A snap of a twig behind me, loud enough to cut through the silence like a gunshot. I whirled around, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast wilderness. No response came, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Probably just a deer, I reasoned aloud, trying to calm my nerves. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching from the shadows of the forest. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. By the time I reached my campsite, a small flat area near a bubbling stream, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. With practiced efficiency, I set up my tent and gathered firewood. As the flames flickered to life, I felt some of my anxiety melt away. The warm glow pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small circle of safety. I heated up some freeze-dried pasta and settled in for the night, my back against a large boulder as I gazed into the fire. The stars were just beginning to appear overhead, pinpricks of light in the deepening twilight. "See? Nothing to worry about," I said to myself, forcing a laugh. But even as the words left my mouth, a chill ran down my spine. In the distance, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps. Too heavy for a deer or even a bear. I held my breath, straining to listen. For a long moment there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then, unmistakably, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. My hand shook as I reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, dancing over the underbrush at the edge of my campsite. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A massive dark shape moving between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. "It's just your imagination," I whispered, but my voice trembled with uncertainty. There's nothing out there. I doused the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight. Inside, I curled up in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sent my heart racing. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to overtake fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my best efforts to stay alert, I felt myself drifting off. Just before sleep claimed me, a final thought flitted through my mind. I should never have come out here alone. As consciousness faded, I was unaware that this would be my last night of peaceful sleep for a long time to come. The horrors that awaited me in the darkness were beyond anything I could have imagined. But for now, nestled in the false security of my tent, I slept, blissfully ignorant of the nightmare that was about to unfold. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The nylon walls of my tent came into focus as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Then I felt it, a tremor running through the ground beneath me. My tent shook violently, as if caught in a localized earthquake. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As I clicked it on, the beam illuminated the interior of my tent, casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when I heard it, deep guttural breathing just inches from where I lay frozen in fear. My blood ran cold. This was no bear. Bears don't breathe like that. This sound was almost human, but not quite. It was primal, savage, and utterly terrifying. I held my breath, hoping against hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But the breathing only grew louder, more insistent. I could smell it now, a pungent, musky odor that made my stomach churn. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across my tent. I bit back a scream as I saw the outline of an enormous hand, if you could call it that, press against the fabric. The fingers were long, ending in what looked like sharp claws. "Oh God," I whimpered, pressing myself as far back as I could in my sleeping bag. Without warning, that massive hairy arm ripped through the tent fabric, missing my face by mere inches. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the night. The creature outside roared in response, a bone-chilling sound that seemed to shake the very air around me. Adrenaline surged through my body. In one frantic motion, I unzipped my sleeping bag and scrambled backwards, tearing through the rear wall of my tent. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face as I tumbled out onto the forest floor. I stumbled to my feet, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I spun around. And there, illuminated in the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, I caught my first clear glimpse of the monster. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. This was no bear, no known animal. This was the creature of campfire stories and blurry photographs. This was BigFoot. But the BigFoot of legend was a shy, elusive creature. This was a monster straight out of my worst nightmares. It let out another ear-splitting roar, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "This isn't real," I gasped, backing away slowly. "This can't be real." The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew I was in mortal danger. There was no curiosity in that gaze, no hint of the gentle giant from folklore. There was only hunger and rage. It took a step towards me, its massive foot crushing my ruined tent like it was tissue paper. I turned and ran, blind panic driving me forward into the dark forest. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Trees creaked and snapped as it barreled through them, gaining on me with every stride. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed myself harder. I knew that slowing down meant certain death. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of what was happening, but fear had taken over completely. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was no one around for miles. "Somebody please help me." I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was closer than I thought, its long arms reaching out towards me. In the moonlight, I could see its eyes clearly now. Two glowing orbs filled with primal hunger. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling head over heels down a steep embankment. Rocks and twigs tore at my skin as I rolled, unable to stop my descent. I came to a jarring halt at the bottom, the wind knocked out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and in pain. Every part of my body screamed in agony. I tasted blood in my mouth and felt a warm trickle down the side of my face. But the sound of snapping trees above me jolted me back to reality. The monster was still coming. I dragged myself to my feet, limping as fast as I could. My flashlight was gone, lost in the fall, but the moonlight provided just enough illumination to navigate by. I had no idea where I was or which direction I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow potentially hiding another monster. My breath came in ragged gasps and my heart felt like it might burst from my chest. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. As I ran, my mind raced with questions. How was this possible? Bigfoot wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Yet the memory of those glowing eyes and sharp teeth was burned into my brain. This was no man in a suit, no elaborate hoax. This was something beyond my understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of pure terror. But eventually, I spotted something ahead. A small opening in the side of a hill. A cave. Without hesitation, I dove into the darkness, pressing myself as far back into the cave as I could. I curled into a ball, trying to make myself as small as possible. My entire body shook with exhaustion and fear. Outside, I could hear the creature moving, its heavy breathing echoing in the night air. Twigs snapped under its feet as it paced back and forth. I held my breath, terrified that even the slightest sound would give away my position. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was praying to. "Please just let it go away." But as the sounds of the creature grew closer to my hiding spot, I realized with growing horror that my ordeal was far from over. The night was still young, and the monster was still hunting. I don't know how long I huddled in that cave, my body trembling with each labored breath. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes feeling like hours as I strained my ears for any sign of the creature. The forest outside had gone eerily quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting. Just as I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the monster had moved on, a low, rumbling growl shattered the silence. It was close. Too close. My heart, which I thought couldn't possibly beat any faster, kicked into overdrive. I pressed myself further into the cave, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into my back. The darkness that had seemed like a sanctuary now felt oppressive, closing in around me. A shadow fell across the cave entrance. I could see the outline of the creature's massive form, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Its head swiveled from side to side, searching for me. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. Tears streamed down my face as I watched those long, clawed fingers reach into the cave, scraping against the rock mere feet from where I sat. This isn't happening, I thought desperately. This can't be real. But the rank, musky odor that filled the air was all too real. The sound of its breathing, heavy and guttural, was no figment of my imagination. Suddenly, its eyes locked onto mine. In the darkness of the cave, they seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was it. I was going to die here, torn apart by a creature that shouldn't exist. But some primal instinct, some deep-seated will to survive, took over. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I launched myself forward, ducking under the creature's grasping arms and out of the cave. I ran blindly through the dark forest, branches whipping my face as I heard the creature's heavy footsteps behind me. The sound of trees snapping and crashing to the ground told me it was giving chase, plowing through obstacles that slowed me down. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. Somebody, please. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, knowing that slowing down meant certain death. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and the monster as possible. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature was closer than I thought, its long arms reaching out, fingers grasping at the air just behind me. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I could see its eyes clearly, two glowing orbs fixed on me with predatory intensity. The sight gave me a burst of speed I didn't know I possessed. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my feet barely seeming to touch the ground. But it wasn't enough. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, hear the snap of its jaws as it lunged for me. In desperation, I veered sharply to the right, hoping to throw it off. My foot caught on a root, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was done for. But instead of falling, I found myself airborne, tumbling down a steep embankment I hadn't seen in the darkness. I rolled uncontrollably, rocks and twigs tearing at my skin. Pain exploded through my body with each impact. I could hear the creature roaring in frustration above me, unable to follow my unintentional escape route. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a jarring halt at the bottom of the slope. I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath, every part of me screaming in agony. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, and I could feel warm trickles running down my face and arms. "Get up," I wheezed to myself. "Get up, Sarah, you have to move." But my body refused to cooperate. The adrenaline that had fueled my flight was fading, leaving me weak and shaking. I managed to roll onto my side, fighting waves of nausea as the world spun around me. That's when I heard it, the sound of snapping trees and a furious roar from above. The creature had found a way down and was coming for me. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. Ignoring the protests of my battered body, I staggered to my feet. My right ankle buckled under me, sending a sharp pain up my leg. Sprained, maybe broken. It didn't matter. I had to keep moving. I limped forward as fast as I could, using trees for support. The forest floor was treacherous, littered with fallen branches and hidden dips. Each step was agony, but the sound of pursuit behind me drove me onward. "This isn't happening," I muttered between ragged breaths. "Wake up, Sarah. Wake up." But there was no waking up from this nightmare. The pain was too real, the fear too visceral. This was happening, whether I believed it or not. I don't know how long I stumbled through the darkness. Time lost all meaning in the face of sheer survival. My world narrowed to the space immediately in front of me, to the next tree I could use to pull myself forward. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fade and then grow louder in turns. Was it toying with me? Did it enjoy the chase? Or was my mind playing tricks on me, amplifying every snapped twig and rustled leaf into the approach of the monster? Just as I thought I couldn't take another step, the trees thinned out ahead of me. I could see moonlight reflecting off water, a lake or a wide river, I couldn't tell which. Hope surged through me. If I could make it to the water, maybe I could lose the creature. With renewed determination, I pushed myself toward the shoreline. My feet slipped on the muddy bank, and I went down hard, sliding the last few feet on my stomach. The shock of the cold water as I splashed into the shallows jolted me back to full alertness. I crawled deeper, ignoring the pain as rocks scraped my palms and knees. When it was deep enough, I started to swim, each stroke sending waves of agony through my battered body. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, I heard a tremendous splash. The creature had reached the water's edge. I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on putting distance between us. The water grew colder as I swam further from shore, numbing my aching muscles. Finally, when my arms felt like lead and I could barely keep my head above water, I allowed myself to look back. The shoreline was a dark smudge in the distance. Of the creature, there was no sign. Had I lost it? Or was it out there somewhere waiting? As the adrenaline faded, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. Every part of me hurt. I was cold, exhausted, and completely lost. But I was alive, treading water, I tried to get my bearings. In the pre-dawn light, I could make out a small island not too far away. It wasn't much, but it was something to aim for. Somewhere I could rest and try to figure out what to do next. As I slowly made my way toward the island, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This isn't over. The night might be ending, but my ordeal was far from finished. The creature was still out there, and I was a long way from safety. The small island loomed before me, a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. My arms felt like lead, each stroke a monumental effort as I pushed through the cold water. When my feet finally touched the bottom, I nearly wept with relief. I dragged myself onto the shore, collapsing onto the rocky ground. For a moment I just lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The events of the night crashed over me in waves, each memory more terrifying than the last. Get up, I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. You can't stay here. With agonizing slowness, I pushed myself to my feet. Dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the landscape. The island was smaller than I'd thought, mostly rock with a few scraggly trees clinging to life. But there, on the far side, I saw something that made my heart leap, a small cave barely visible among the boulders. I limped towards it, every step sending jolts of pain through my battered body. As I got closer, I realized it was more of a narrow crevice than a proper cave, but it was deep enough to provide some shelter. I squeezed inside, the rough rock scraping against my skin. Once in, I allowed myself to slump to the ground. I was safe, for the moment at least. But as the adrenaline faded, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. My right ankle was swollen and throbbing, likely sprained if not broken. Cuts and bruises covered my arms and legs, and a particularly nasty gash on my forehead had crusted over with dried blood. I took stock of what I had left. My clothes were soaked and torn. I'd lost my backpack with all my supplies during the initial attack. No food, no water, no first aid kit. All I had was the clothes on my back and the small pocket knife I always kept in my pants pocket. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. Here I was, stranded on a tiny island, injured and alone, being hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist. It was absurd. It was terrifying. Focus, Sarah, I muttered, pressing my palms against my eyes. You're not dead yet. Think. I needed to get help, but I had no idea where I was or how far I'd swum. The shore I'd come from was visible, but it was just an unbroken line of trees. No signs of civilization. No way to know which direction might lead to safety. A sound from outside snapped me out of my thoughts. Something splashing in the water. My breath caught in my throat as I peered out of the cave entrance. There, wading through the shallows towards the island, was the creature. In the growing light, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more terrifying than I'd imagined. Massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that scanned the shoreline. I pressed myself further into the cave, praying that the shadows would hide me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the creature would hear it. The beast lumbered onto the shore, its massive feet leaving deep imprints in the wet sand. It moved with an eerie grace for something so large, its head swiveling as it searched for any sign of me. I watched, paralyzed with fear as it began to circle the island. Its nostrils flared, and I realized with horror that it was trying to catch my scent. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to muffle the sound of my ragged breathing. Hours passed like an eternity as I remained motionless, terrified that the slightest movement would give me away. The creature paced back and forth, sometimes coming so close to my hiding spot that I could see the individual hairs on its massive body. At one point, it paused right in front of the cave entrance. I could smell its musky animal odor. Its breathing was deep and guttural, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I pressed myself against the back of the cave, my nails digging into my palms as I fought to stay silent. Please, I thought desperately. Please, just go away. After what felt like hours, the creature finally moved on. I heard it splash back into the water, but I didn't dare move. Not yet. It could be a trick, a ploy to draw me out. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the temperature in the cave rose. Sweat mingled with dried blood on my skin, and my throat burned with thirst. But still, I didn't move. It wasn't until the light began to fade again, signaling the approach of evening, that I finally gathered the courage to peek out. The island appeared deserted. No sign of the creature, just the lapping of water against the shore and the call of birds in the distance. Cautiously, I crawled out of the cave, my stiff muscles protesting every movement. The cool evening air was a relief after the stifling heat of the day. I stumbled to the water's edge, cupping my hands to drink. The water was brackish, but it was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. As I straightened up, wiping my mouth, I froze. There, in the mud near the water, was a set of massive footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of long, curved claws at the end of each toe. "Oh God," I whispered, stumbling backward. "It's real. It's all real." The footprints were undeniable proof of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. But even as I stared at them, I watched the water slowly erode the edges, washing away the evidence. As darkness fell again, panic set in. I couldn't stay on this island forever, but I had no idea how to get back to civilization. And somewhere out there, the creature was waiting, hunting, for me. I retreated back to my cave, huddling in the entrance. The stars were coming out, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. Somewhere out there was safety, was home. But between me and that safety was a monster straight out of nightmares. As I sat there shivering in the growing cold, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The night stretched before me, long and full of terrors, and I had no choice but to face them if I wanted to survive. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stirred from my fitful sleep. Every muscle in my body ached, a stark reminder of the nightmare I'd endured. I crawled out of the small cave, wincing as my injuries made themselves known anew. The island was quiet, eerily so. No sign of the creature, but its presence lingered like a shadow in my mind. I couldn't stay here. I had to find my way back to civilization, back to safety. I studied the shoreline in the distance, trying to gauge which direction might lead to help. To the north, I thought I could make out a faint trail of smoke rising above the tree line. It could be nothing, or it could be my salvation. "Okay, Sarah," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse from dehydration and fear. "You can do this, just keep moving." I waded into the water, gritting my teeth against the cold. My clothes, still damp from the night before, clung to my skin. The swim back to shore was agonizing, my battered body protesting every stroke. But the fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface drove me on. As I dragged myself onto the beach, I collapsed, gasping for breath. My body screamed in agony as I forced myself to stand. I took a moment to assess my situation. My right ankle was swollen and purple, barely able to bear weight. Cuts and bruises covered my arms and legs, and the gash on my forehead had reopened, blood trickling down my face. I tore a strip from the bottom of my shirt, using it to bind my ankle as best I could. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With a deep breath, I started my journey into the forest, heading towards where I'd seen the smoke. The going was slow and painful. Every step sent jolts of pain through my body. Pain exploded through my already battered body, and for a moment the world went dark around the edges. As I struggled to get up, I heard it. Heavy breathing, right behind me. Slowly, I turned my head. There it stood, mere feet away. The creature, BigFoot, towered over me, its massive form blocking out the sun. In the daylight, it was even more terrifying. Matted fur covered its body, and its eyes. God, its eyes were filled with an intelligence that was almost human, but twisted with something primal and savage. I scrambled backward, leaves and twigs digging into my palms. "Please," I gasped, though I knew it was useless. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't interested in communication. It took a step forward and I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then a sound cut through the air, a car horn, distant but unmistakable. The creature's head snapped up, its attention drawn to the noise. In that moment of distraction, I found a reserve of strength I didn't know I had. I lurched to my feet and ran, pushing my battered body beyond its limits. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. Each step a battle against pain and exhaustion. The sound of pursuit faded, replaced by the pounding of blood in my ears. When I finally burst out onto the dirt road, I nearly cried with relief. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. I turned, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line, but the forest was still. I limped along the road, my eyes scanning desperately for any sign of life. The sun beat down mercilessly and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I was reaching my limit. Just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it. The rumble of an engine. A battered pickup truck came around the bend, driven by an elderly man with a weathered face. He slammed on the brakes when he saw me, his eyes widening in shock. "Good Lord, girl," he exclaimed, jumping out of the truck. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? Instead, I burst into tears, the events of the past day and night finally overwhelming me. It's okay," the man said, gently helping me into the passenger seat. "I'm gonna get you to a hospital, all right?" As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, dark shape moving among the trees. But then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. The truck bumped along the dirt road, each jolt sending waves of pain through my body. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to relax. I was safe. I had survived. But as the adrenaline faded and exhaustion set in, a new fear began to take hold. Would anyone believe what had happened to me? As the forest receded behind us and we approached the outskirts of civilization, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The battle for survival might be ending, but the struggle to make sense of what had happened, and to make others believe it, was just beginning. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital emergency room made me wince as I was wheeled in on a gurney. The elderly man who had found me, John, had insisted on bringing me straight here despite my mumbled protests. Now, surrounded by the sterile white walls and the bustle of medical staff, the events of the past day seemed even more surreal. A nurse with kind eyes approached, her brow furrowing as she took in my battered appearance. "Can you tell me your name, honey?" she asked gently. "Sarah," I croaked, my throat raw from screaming and dehydration. "Sarah Green." "Okay, Sarah. I'm Nurse Martinez. Can you tell me what happened to you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain? The words tumbled out in a jumbled rush. I was hiking. There was this creature, BigFoot. It attacked me. I swam, hid in a cave. Nurse Martinez exchanged a glance with a nearby doctor, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. "All right, Sarah," the doctor said, stepping forward. "Let's get you checked out first, okay? We'll worry about the details later." The next few hours passed in a blur of examinations, x-rays, and questions. My injuries were catalogued with clinical precision. A sprained ankle, multiple lacerations and contusions, mild dehydration, and possible concussion. Each touch, each question, brought flashes of memory. The creature's roar, its glowing eyes, the terror of being hunted. As a young resident stitched up the gash on my forehead, I tried again to explain. "You don't understand," I insisted, wincing as the needle pierced my skin. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was BigFoot. I saw it clearly. The resident's hand paused for a moment, and I saw him struggle to keep his expression neutral. "Ms. Green," he said carefully, "you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us in stressful situations." I felt a stab of frustration and fear. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. How could they? "I know what I saw," I said, my voice rising. "It was real. It was right there in front of me." A new voice cut through my rising panic. "Ms. Green?" I looked up to see a man in a ranger uniform standing in the doorway. "I'm Ranger Thompson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your experience in the forest if you're feeling up to it." I nodded, hope flaring in my chest. Surely a forest ranger would understand, would believe me. Ranger Thompson pulled up a chair, his weathered face serious. "Can you walk me through what happened, from the beginning?" I took a deep breath and started from the beginning. The peaceful hike, the first signs of something wrong, the terrifying attack on my tent. As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into the ranger's eyes, but I pressed on, describing the chase, the swim to the island, the final confrontation. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Ranger Thompson cleared his throat. "Ms. Green, I've been working these forests for over 20 years. We've had bear attacks, mountain lion sightings, but never anything like what you're describing." "I know how it sounds," I said, fighting back tears of frustration. "But I'm telling you, it was real. It was right there in front of me. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion, it was something else." The ranger's voice was gentle, but I could hear the skepticism underneath. "We'll certainly investigate the area where you were found, but I have to be honest with you, Ms. Green. What you're describing, and it's just not possible." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. They didn't believe me. No one believed me. "The footprints," I said suddenly, grasping at straws. "There were footprints on the island. Huge ones. If you look there." "We'll check it out," Ranger Thompson assured me, but his tone made it clear he was just humoring me. "For now, you should rest. You've been through a lot." As he left, I overheard him talking to one of the doctors outside. "Probably a bear attack," he was saying. "The trauma of the experience can cause the mind to create alternative explanations." I slumped back against the pillows, feeling utterly alone. The hospital room suddenly felt too small, too confining. The beep of monitors and the distant chatter of nurses seemed to fade away, replaced by phantom sounds of snapping twigs and heavy breathing. A young nurse entered, carrying a tray with some pills. "These will help you sleep," she said kindly. As she set the tray down, I noticed her glance at my chart, her eyes widening slightly. "You okay, honey?" she asked, her voice lowered. "That must have been some experience you had out there." I looked at her, really looked, and saw something in her eyes. Not the skepticism or pity I'd seen in others, but a flicker of understanding. "You believe me, don't you?" I whispered. She glanced around quickly, then leaned in close. "My granddad used to tell stories," she murmured, "about something in the woods, something big and old and not quite natural. Most folks thought he was crazy, but..." She trailed off, then squeezed my hand. "You get some rest now, okay?" As she left, I felt a small spark of hope. Someone believed me. Or at least didn't entirely disbelieve me. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. I reached for the small bag of personal effects they'd given me. The tattered remains of my clothes, my wallet, and a few other odds and ends that had survived my ordeal. As I rifled through it, my fingers brushed against something coarse. I pulled it out, my heart racing. There, tangled in the fabric of my torn shirt, were a few long, coarse hairs, dark, almost black, and unlike anything I'd ever seen before. My hand shook as I held them up to the light. Proof. Actual physical proof of what I'd encountered. But even as hope surged through me, doubt crept in. Would this be enough? Or would they find some way to explain it away, to categorize it as something known and safe? As exhaustion finally overtook me and I drifted into a fitful sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. My ordeal in the forest might be over, But the real battle, the fight to be believed, to make sense of what had happened to me, was only just beginning. I woke with a start, my heart racing as the sterile hospital room came into focus. For a moment I thought I was back in the forest, the creature's roar echoing in my ears. But it was just the beep of a nearby monitor, the harsh reality of fluorescent lights replacing the terror of the wilderness. A gentle knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Ranger Thompson entered, his face a mask of professional concern. Behind him was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place in the rural hospital. "Ms. Green," Ranger Thompson said, his voice carefully neutral. "How are you feeling this morning?" I sat up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. "I've been better," I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Any news from your investigation?" The ranger exchanged a glance with the man in the suit before responding. "We've conducted a preliminary search of the area where you were found. I'd like to go over a few details with you if you're up for it." I nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe they had found something, some evidence that would prove I wasn't crazy. The man in the suit stepped forward, introducing himself as Agent Miller from the Fish and Wildlife Service. "Ms. Green," he said, his tone professional but skeptical, "can you walk us through your experience one more time? Any details you can remember might be helpful." I took a deep breath and began recounting my ordeal once again. As I spoke, I could see the doubt in their eyes growing. When I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Agent Miller cleared his throat. "Ms. Green, we found some inconsistencies in your story that I'd like to address." My heart sank. "Inconsistencies?" He nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "You mentioned swimming to an island to escape the creature. We've surveyed the area, and there's no island matching your description within swimming distance of where you were found." "That's impossible," I protested, my voice rising. "I was there. I spent the night in a cave on that island." Ranger Thompson stepped in, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, we understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes in high-stress situations our minds can play tricks on us." I felt a surge of anger and frustration. "I'm not crazy," I insisted. "I know what I saw. What about the footprints? The broken trees where it chased me?" Agent Miller consulted his notes. "We did find some disturbed areas in the forest, consistent with a large animal moving through. Most likely a bear, given the region." "A bear?" I repeated incredulously. "It wasn't a bear. It was upright. It was massive. It had almost human-like features." The two men exchanged another glance, and I could read the silent communication between them. They thought I was delusional, traumatized, or both. Suddenly, I remembered the hairs I had found. "Wait," I said, reaching for the bag of my personal effects. "I have proof. There were hairs caught in my clothes. They're not from any animal you know." I dumped out the contents of the bag, frantically searching for the coarse, dark hairs I had discovered earlier. But they were gone. I looked up at the men, panic rising in my throat. They were right here. I swear, they were right here last night. Agent Miller's voice was maddeningly calm. "Ms. Green, we've collected all the physical evidence from your clothing and the surrounding area. We'll have it analyzed, of course, but preliminary findings suggest typical forest fauna. Deer, possibly bear." I felt like I was drowning, grasping at straws that kept slipping through my fingers. "You have to believe me," I pleaded. "It was real. It was right there in front of me. Why would I make this up?" Ranger Thompson sat on the edge of my bed, his face a mixture of pity and concern. "Sarah, no one's saying you're making this up. Trauma can affect our perceptions, our memories. What you experienced was real to you, but you think I'm crazy," I finished bitterly. "No one thinks you're crazy," Agent Miller interjected. "But we have to follow the evidence, and right now, the evidence doesn't support the existence of an unknown bipedal creature in these woods." I slumped back against my pillows, feeling utterly defeated. How could I make them understand when I barely understood it myself? As if sensing my despair, Ranger Thompson changed the subject. The important thing is that you're safe now. Once you're released from the hospital, I'd be happy to escort you back to retrieve any belongings you might have left at your campsite. The thought of going back into those woods sent a chill down my spine. No, I said quickly. No, I don't want to go back there. Agent Miller nodded as if my reaction confirmed something for him. Understandable, given your ordeal. We'll make sure any personal items are returned to you. As they prepared to leave, I made one last, desperate attempt. Please, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Please believe me. I know what I saw. It was real. Ranger Thompson paused at the door, his expression softening slightly. Get some rest, Sarah. We'll be in touch if we find anything else. As the door closed behind them, I was left alone with my thoughts and the lingering terror of my memories. I could hear them talking in low voices just outside my room. Poor girl, Ranger Thompson was saying. Must have been one hell of a bear to spook her that badly. Or one hell of an imagination, Agent Miller replied. Either way, case closed as far as I'm concerned. Just another wild animal encounter blown out of proportion. Their voices faded as they walked away, leaving me in a silence that felt oppressive. I turned to look out the window, half expecting to see a massive, fur-covered figure lurking among the trees in the distance. But there was nothing there. Just the peaceful, indifferent forest that held secrets it would never reveal. As tears of frustration and fear rolled down my cheeks, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The creature might be gone, hidden away in the depths of the wilderness, but its shadow still loomed over me. How could I ever feel safe again knowing what was out there? And how could I live with the knowledge that no one would ever believe the truth of what I had experienced? The hospital room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the beeping monitors a poor substitute for the raw, primal fear I had felt in the forest. In that moment, I almost wished I was back there, face to face with the creature. At least then I wouldn't have to question my own sanity. As night fell, casting long shadows across my room, I steeled myself for the long, lonely journey ahead. The physical wounds would heal, but the mental scars, the knowledge of what lurked in the darkness of the forest, would stay with me forever. And I would have to bear that burden alone, in a world that refused to believe the truth of what I had seen. The drive home from the hospital was a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. My sister, Emily, had come to pick me up, her face a mask of concern and barely concealed skepticism. The doctors had discharged me with a handful of prescriptions and a referral to a trauma counselor. But how could I explain to a therapist what I had experienced when no one believed me? As we pulled up to my apartment building, Emily turned to me, her voice gentle. Sarah, you know you can stay with me for a while if you want. You don't have to be alone right now. I shook my head, forcing a weak smile. Thanks, Em, but I need some time to process everything. On my own. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but promise me you'll call if you need anything. Day or night, all right? I promised, but as I watched her drive away, I felt a crushing wave of loneliness wash over me. How could I explain to her, to anyone, what I had been through? Entering my apartment, I was struck by how normal everything looked. The stack of mail on the counter, the unwashed coffee mug in the sink, it all seemed to belong to a different life, a different Sarah. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now felt alien. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every shadow, every creak of the building settling. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, knowing logically that I was safe here, but unable to shake the feeling of being hunted. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, inhuman eyes staring back at me. I could smell the creature's musky odor, hear its guttural breathing. At 3 a.m., I gave up trying to rest and turned on my laptop. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before I typed, BigFoot sightings, Colorado. The screen filled with results, blurry photos, sensationalized news articles, conspiracy theory websites. I clicked through them frantically, searching for something, anything that might validate my experience. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping through my windows when my phone buzzed. A text from my boss. Heard what happened. Take all the time you need. Let us know when you're ready to come back. I stared at the message, a lump forming in my throat. How could I go back to my normal life? How could I sit in meetings, write code, make small talk with colleagues when I knew what was out there? The day passed in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Friends called and texted, their messages full of concern and thinly veiled curiosity. I ignored most of them, unable to face their questions, their doubt. In the afternoon, there was a knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat, irrational fear gripping me. It took me several deep breaths before I could approach the peephole. It was Mrs. Gonzalez from next door, holding a covered dish. I opened the door a crack, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Gonzalez." "Sarah, dear," she said, her kind face creased with worry. "I heard about your accident in the woods. I brought you some soup." "Thank you," I murmured, accepting the dish. "That's very kind." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. I heard you had quite a fright out there. With some kind of animal?" I tensed, unsure how to respond. It was pretty scary," I managed. Mrs. Gonzalez nodded sympathetically. "My Carlos, God rest his soul, he used to go hunting in those mountains. He always said there were things out there that couldn't be explained, things that were best left alone." For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Did she believe me? But then she patted my arm and continued, "But don't you worry, dear. Whatever it was, you're safe now. These things have a way of seeming bigger and scarier in the moment, you know." I nodded numbly, thanked her again, and closed the door, and closed. Leaning against it, I slid to the floor, the soup forgotten beside me. Even those who meant well couldn't understand, couldn't believe. As evening approached, I found myself standing at my window, staring out at the city. The bustling streets and glowing windows should have been comforting, a reminder of civilization and safety. Instead, they felt like an illusion, a thin veneer covering a world that was far more dangerous and mysterious than anyone realized. My phone buzzed again, another concerned text from Emily. I started to type a response, then stopped. What could I say? That I was fine? That I was losing my mind? That every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, felt its hot breath on my skin? I set the phone down and walked to my bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines. They stopped on a worn copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I pulled it out, remembering how I used to love Thoreau's reflections on nature, on solitude. Now his words seemed naive, ignorant of the true terrors that lurked in the wilderness. As I flipped through the pages, a small scrap of paper fell out, a brochure for the hiking trail where my nightmare had begun. I must have used it as a bookmark once, never imagining how that place would change my life. I stared at the glossy photos of serene forests and majestic mountains. They looked so peaceful, so inviting. But I knew the truth that lurked behind those images. I knew what was out there waiting in the shadows. A sudden irrational urge gripped me. I needed to go back, to prove to myself, to everyone, that I wasn't crazy, that what I had seen was real. "No," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet apartment. "No, I can't." But even as I said it, I knew the thought wouldn't leave me. The need for validation, for proof, was overwhelming. I looked at my phone, considering calling Ranger Thompson, asking to see the investigation reports. But what good would that do? They had already dismissed my story. As night fell once again, I found myself at my laptop, researching trail cameras and other equipment. If no one would believe me, maybe I could find the evidence myself. But even as I scrolled through the options, a part of me recoiled at the thought of going back into those woods. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. The city lights blurred through my tears, and I realized I was trapped between the terror of what I had experienced and the isolation of not being believed, between the need to prove my sanity and the fear of facing that creature again. As I stood there, caught between two impossible choices, I knew that whatever decision I made would change my life forever. The Sarah who had entered those woods was gone. Now, I had to figure out who I was going to be in the aftermath of an encounter that no one believed, but that I could never forget. The decision to return to the forest came to me in the dead of night, born from a mix of desperation and a need for closure that I couldn't shake. I knew it was reckless, possibly even suicidal, but the alternative, living with this gnawing uncertainty and disbelief from others, seemed unbearable. I set out before dawn, my hands shaking as I loaded my car with supplies. This time I was prepared, or as prepared as one could be to face a creature that shouldn't exist. My backpack was filled with a high-powered flashlight, a first aid kit, some food and water, and a small canister of bear spray. In my pocket, I carried a personal locator beacon, a last-ditch emergency device I hoped I wouldn't need to use. As I drove towards the mountains, the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky. The beauty of the landscape felt like a cruel joke, hiding the horrors I knew lurked within. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I approached the familiar turnoff to the trailhead. I parked my car and sat there for a long moment, my heart racing. "You can do this, Sarah," I whispered to myself, trying to summon courage I wasn't sure I possessed. "You need answers." The trail looked different in the early morning light, less menacing, but no less foreboding. Each step felt like a battle against my own instincts, which screamed at me to turn back. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to validate my experience, to prove to myself and others that I wasn't crazy. As I hiked deeper into the forest, memories of my previous journey flooded back. I recognized the clearing where I had first heard the creature, the steep embankment I had tumbled down in my frantic escape. Each familiar sight sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to continue. Hours passed, and I found myself approaching the area where I believed the island should be. But as I emerged from the tree line, my heart sank. There was no island, no lake, just an expansive meadow stretching out before me. "This isn't right," I muttered, pulling out my map with trembling hands. "It should be right here." I spun in a slow circle, trying to orient myself. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was my memory playing tricks on me? Or had the trauma of my experience distorted my perception of the landscape? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, a sense of unease settled over me. I needed to make a decision: press on in the fading light or make camp for the night. The thought of spending the night in these woods terrified me, but the idea of trying to navigate back in the dark seemed equally daunting. With a heavy heart, I began to set up my tent. My hands shook as I drove the stakes into the ground, every sound from the surrounding forest making me jump. As darkness fell, I retreated inside, zipping the tent flap securely behind me. I lay there, my flashlight clutched to my chest, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. The normal nighttime noises of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, took on a sinister quality in my heightened state of alertness. Hours passed, sleep eluding me entirely. Then, just as the first hint of pre-dawn light began to filter through the tent fabric, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy footsteps, moving with purpose through the forest. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping under tremendous weight. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, please, not again." I fumbled for the bear spray, my hands slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For a long, agonizing moment there was silence. Then, a deep, guttural breathing, a sound that haunted my nightmares. In that moment, all my doubts vanished. I knew with absolute certainty that the creature was real. that my memories weren't a product of trauma or imagination. It was here, mere feet away, separated from me by only a thin layer of nylon. My heart pounded so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but terror had frozen me in place. I watched, paralyzed, as a massive shadow fell across my tent. Then, without warning, a huge clawed hand ripped through the tent fabric, missing my face by inches. I let out a blood-curdling scream, my paralysis finally broken. In one frantic motion, I unzipped the tent and burst out into the pre-dawn darkness. The creature roared, a sound of primal rage that seemed to shake the very air. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, my only thought to put distance between myself and the monster. I could hear it behind me, trees snapping like twigs as it gave chase. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror drove me onward. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was closer than I thought, its massive form silhouetted against the lightening sky. In the growing light, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. Over 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence and a hunger that chilled me to my core. I turned back, pushing myself harder, knowing that to slow down meant certain death. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my mind focused solely on survival. I had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to escape. As I burst into a small clearing, my foot caught on a root, sending me tumbling to the ground. Pain exploded through my body as I rolled, coming to a stop against a fallen log. For a moment, the world spun around me and I struggled to catch my breath. Then I heard it, the heavy breathing, the snapping of branches. I looked up to see the creature enter the clearing, its massive form blocking out the early morning light. It paused, its glowing eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. In that moment, as I lay there bruised and battered, staring into the face of a monster that defied explanation, I realized the true cost of my quest for validation. I had sought answers, closure, proof, and in doing so, I had put myself directly in the path of a danger beyond imagining. As the creature took a step towards me, a low growl rumbling from its chest, I knew that my journey for truth might very well cost me my life. And in the face of this primal terror, all thoughts of evidence, of being believed, faded away. There was only the desperate, all-consuming need to survive. Time seemed to stand still as I lay there, my eyes locked with the creature's glowing, predatory gaze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move, paralyzed by a primal fear I had never known before. The BigFoot took another step forward, its massive foot crushing the undergrowth. The sound jolted me back to reality, and adrenaline surged through my body. In one desperate motion, I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my battered limbs. I ran like I had never run before, my feet barely touching the ground as I tore through the forest. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roar of frustration, followed by the thunderous sound of its pursuit. Trees whipped past me in a blur. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and the monster. My lungs burned, and my muscles screamed in protest, but terror drove me onward. Suddenly, the trees thinned out, and I found myself bursting onto a dirt road. For a split second, hope flared in my chest. Civilization. Safety. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. There were no cars, no people, just an empty stretch of road cutting through the wilderness. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line, but there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest. Had I lost it? Or was it toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike? Not willing to take any chances, I started jogging down the road, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of the monster or, hopefully, rescue. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the daylight, it all seemed so normal, so peaceful. If not for the terror still coursing through my veins, I might have thought I had imagined the whole thing. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the rumble of an engine. A battered pickup truck came around the bend, driven by an elderly man with a weathered face. He slammed on the brakes when he saw me, his eyes widening in shock. "Good Lord, girl," he exclaimed, jumping out of the truck. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? Instead, I burst into tears, the events of the past 2 days finally overwhelming me. It's okay," the man said, gently helping me into the passenger seat. "I'm gonna get you to a hospital, all right? Name's John, by the way." As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, dark shape moving among the trees. But then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur. John tried to make conversation, to ask what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. How could I explain the inexplicable? At the hospital, I was immediately whisked away by a team of nurses and doctors. Their voices washed over me as they assessed my injuries, asked questions I couldn't answer. I caught snippets of their conversations. Severe dehydration, multiple lacerations, possible concussion. As a young doctor cleaned and stitched a particularly nasty gash on my arm, he tried to gently probe for information. "Can you tell me what happened out there, Sarah?" I looked at him, seeing the concern in his eyes, but also the skepticism lurking beneath. I took a deep breath and decided to try. "I was hiking and there was this creature. It attacked me. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion, it was something else." The doctor's hands paused for a moment and I saw him exchange a glance with a nearby nurse. "Something else?" he asked carefully. "It was huge," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in fur. It walked on 2 legs. It looked almost human, but not quite. There was a long silence. Then the doctor spoke, his voice gentle but patronizing. "Sarah, you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes in high-stress situations, our minds can play tricks on us. It's a normal response to extreme fear." I felt a wave of frustration and despair wash over me. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. How could they? As the day wore on, a parade of people came through my hospital room. Nurses, doctors, a local sheriff, even a wildlife officer. Each one asked the same questions, and each one reacted with the same mix of concern and disbelief when I told my story. By evening I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. A kind-faced nurse came in to check my vitals one last time before the night shift. As she worked, she hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories," she said, her eyes meeting mine, "about something in those woods. Something not natural. Most folks thought he was crazy, but..." She trailed off, then squeezed my hand. "You get some rest now, okay?" As she left, I felt a small spark of hope. Someone believed me, or at least didn't entirely disbelieve me. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, the events of the past 2 days played on repeat in my mind. The initial attack, the terrifying chase, the final confrontation. It all seemed so surreal, yet the aches in my body and the fear still coursing through my veins were undeniably real. I knew that my ordeal wasn't over. The physical wounds would heal, but the mental scars, the knowledge of what lurked in the darkness of the forest, would stay with me forever. And I would have to bear that burden alone, in a world that refused to believe the truth of what I had seen. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. The creature was still out there. And while I had escaped this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths would cross again. The forest held its secrets close, and I had glimpsed something that defied explanation, something that, for better or worse, had changed my life forever. In the darkness of the hospital room, with the distant beep of monitors and the muffled voices of the night staff, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to prove what I had seen. Not for the world, not for validation, but for myself. Because I knew the truth, and that truth would haunt me until the day I died. The Bigfoot had escaped back into the depths of the forest, leaving me with nothing but memories and nightmares. But as I finally succumbed to exhaustion, I realized that this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. As I steered my old Jeep Cherokee along the winding mountain road, the dense Idaho forest seemed to close in around me. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I'd been driving for hours, leaving the bustling streets of Boise far behind in search of solitude and adventure in the Sawtooth National Forest. "You've got this, Tom," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. A weekend alone in the wilderness is just what you need. The radio crackled with static, the signal fading as I climbed higher into the mountains. I switched it off, embracing the silence. It was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city, but as the minutes ticked by, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The GPS on my phone chirped, announcing my arrival at the turnoff for Pinewood Campground. I slowed the Jeep, carefully navigating the unpaved road that led deeper into the forest. The branches of overhanging trees scraped against the roof, creating an eerie soundtrack to my approach. As I pulled into the small parking area, I was struck by the absolute stillness of the place. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing unease that had settled in my gut. "It's just nerves," I told myself. "You're not used to being this isolated." I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and made my way to the ranger station, a small, weathered cabin at the edge of the clearing. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard greeted me from behind the counter, his Forest Service uniform neatly pressed despite the remote location. "Welcome to Pinewood," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "You must be Tom Taylor. You're our only reservation for the night." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That's me. Guess I'll have the place to myself, huh?" The ranger, his name tag read Johnson, frowned slightly. "Listen, son, I gotta warn you, we've had some issues lately. Animal attacks in the area. Nothing too serious, but enough to make us cautious." My heart skipped a beat. Animal attacks? What kind of animals are we talking about? Ranger Johnson shrugged, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Bears, mostly. Maybe a mountain lion. Can't be too sure. Just keep your food sealed up tight and don't go wandering off the marked trails, all right?" I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, of course, thanks for the heads up." He handed me a map of the campground and surrounding trails. "You're in site number 7. It's about a quarter mile down that path," he said, pointing out the window. "Any problems, you come straight back here. I'll be on duty all night." As I turned to leave, Ranger Johnson called out, "Oh, and Taylor, if you hear any strange noises in the night, just stay in your tent. It's probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced another smile and headed out. The path to my campsite was well maintained but narrow, hemmed in on both sides by thick underbrush. As I walked, the silence of the forest seemed to deepen. No squirrels scampering through the leaves, no birds calling from the treetops. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I reached Site 7 and dropped my backpack with a sigh of relief. The small clearing was surrounded by towering pines, with a fire pit at its center and a wooden picnic table off to one side. It was perfect, or it would have been if not for the growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. As I began to set up my tent, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the campsite. The temperature dropped quickly, and I found myself shivering despite the exertion. I worked faster, driven by an irrational urge to have shelter before darkness fell completely. Just as I was hammering in the last tent stake, a sound echoed through the valley, a long, mournful howl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was something bigger, something primal. The sound sent goosebumps racing across my skin, and I fumbled the mallet, dropping it with a dull thud on the forest floor. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, scanning the tree line. The forest remained still and silent, offering no answers. With shaking hands, I finished setting up camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the deepening shadows between the trees. As night fell in earnest, I retreated to my tent, heart pounding in my chest. I zipped the entrance closed, knowing full well how flimsy a barrier it would be against whatever made that sound. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sign of movement outside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of a branch or rustle of leaves. Each sound made me flinch, imagining massive creatures lurking just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to overtake fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself drifting off despite my best efforts to stay alert. Just as sleep was about to claim me, a new sound jolted me back to full consciousness. Heavy footsteps circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any normal forest animal. They moved around the perimeter of my campsite, pausing occasionally as if their owner was studying my tent. Panic rose in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers, debating whether to shine it outside or stay hidden in the darkness. Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, a deep rumbling growl vibrated through the air, so low I felt it in my bones more than heard it. It was a sound of pure, primal aggression, the warning of a predator to its prey. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the minutes stretched on. Eventually the footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent and fading into the forest. But the silence that followed brought no relief. Whatever was out there, I knew with certainty would be back. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I hadn't slept a wink. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What I had heard last night defied explanation, and I knew that my peaceful camping trip had turned into something far more dangerous. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent and peered out into the misty morning. The campsite looked undisturbed, but as I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. There, in the soft earth near my tent, was a single massive footprint, far too large to be human, its shape unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. In that moment, I knew that the true horror of my journey into these mountains was just beginning. I stood frozen, staring at the massive footprint near my tent, my mind reeling. The morning mist swirled around my ankles and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I blinked hard, hoping the print would disappear, but it remained, a stark reminder that something unnatural had visited my campsite during the night. "This can't be real," I muttered, my voice sounding small and frightened in the stillness of the forest. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I tried to take a picture of the footprint. But as I aimed the camera, my heart sank. The screen was black, unresponsive. Dead battery. Of course. "Damn it," I hissed, shoving the useless device back into my pocket. The sound of my own voice seemed to break the spell, and suddenly I was acutely aware of how exposed I was. I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen and heard. "It's just a bear," I told myself, not believing it for a second. "A really, really big bear that walks on two legs." I spent the next few hours huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound from the forest. The peaceful solitude I'd sought now felt like a trap. By mid-morning, hunger and the need for a distraction finally drove me out. I decided to make breakfast, hoping the familiar routine would calm my nerves. As I rummaged through my cooler for supplies, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Get it together, Tom," I muttered, turning back to my task. But as I lit my camp stove, another sound froze me in place. Heavy footsteps, circling just beyond the tree line. My hand shook as I reached for the can of bear spray attached to my belt, my only defense against whatever was out there. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. Then, without warning, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood there, muscles tense, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I decided to investigate. "This is a terrible idea," I muttered to myself as I crept toward the edge of the campsite, bear spray clutched tightly in my hand. As I approached the tree line, a pungent, musky odor assaulted my nostrils. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before, a mixture of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else. Something alien. The stench was so strong it made me gag, and I stumbled backward, covering my nose and mouth with my free hand. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement between the trees. Something large covered in dark fur, moving with surprising speed for its size. My breath caught in my throat as a pair of yellow eyes locked onto mine for a split second before the creature disappeared deeper into the forest. I stood there paralyzed, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination born from fear and lack of sleep. But the lingering stench and the sound of snapping branches in the distance told me otherwise. Panic finally overcame me, and I sprinted back to my tent, fumbling with the zipper as I practically dove inside. I lay there, breath coming in ragged gasps, straining my ears for any sign that the creature was returning. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, over and over like a mantra. "This can't be happening." But deep down I knew it was. The footprint, the sounds, the smell, the glimpse of something impossible. It was all real, and I was alone in the wilderness with it. As the day wore on, I remained in my tent, too terrified to venture out again. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if all the normal wildlife had fled. The silence was broken only by the occasional distant snap of a branch or rustle of leaves, each sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, to convince myself it was just a bear or some other known animal. But the image of those intelligent, predatory eyes kept flashing in my mind. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't anything that should exist in these woods, or anywhere else. As evening approached, hunger and thirst finally forced me to leave the relative safety of my tent. I moved quickly, gathering my food and water, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The lengthening shadows seemed to dance and shift, playing tricks on my eyes. I had just finished a hurried meal when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the same sound I'd heard the night before, but closer now, more menacing. My hand shook as I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the campsite. The light caught something at the edge of the trees, two glowing yellow eyes reflecting back at me. They were set high off the ground, far taller than any animal I knew. "Oh, God," I whispered, stumbling backward. The eyes blinked once, slowly, then vanished. But I could hear movement in the underbrush, circling the campsite. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed and huddling in my sleeping bag. My flashlight beam danced wildly around the small space as my hand shook uncontrollably. Outside, the footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of deep, heavy breathing. Something brushed against the side of the tent, and I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The fabric bulged inward, as if something massive was leaning against it. I could hear sniffing sounds, loud and animalistic. Then suddenly, it all stopped. The pressure on the tent released, and the footsteps receded into the distance. But I knew better than to feel relieved. This wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me. like a cat playing with its prey before the kill. As the night wore on, I lay awake, every muscle tense, waiting for the creature's return. The forest had come alive with unfamiliar sounds, grunts, howls, and the crash of something large moving through the underbrush. It was out there, watching, waiting. In those long, terrifying hours, I realized a chilling truth. I wasn't just camping in the woods anymore. I was trapped in a predator's territory, and it was only a matter of time before it decided to strike. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. As soon as it was light enough, I would make a run for my car and get as far away from this place as possible. But even as I formed this plan, a part of me wondered if it was already too late, if the creature out there would let me leave at all. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, I lay in my tent, every muscle tense, listening to the forest slowly come alive. The night had been a nightmare of strange noises and terrifying close encounters, leaving me exhausted and on edge. But I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to make a run for it. With trembling hands, I began to pack my essentials into my backpack. Each rustle of the sleeping bag or zip of a compartment seemed deafening in the morning quiet. I paused frequently, straining my ears for any sign of the creature's return. "Okay, Tom," I whispered to myself, trying to summon some courage. "On 3, you're going to open the tent and make a break for the car. 1, 2. Before I could reach 3, a deafening roar shattered the morning silence. It was close. Too close. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized the creature must be right outside my tent. In that moment of paralyzing fear, I made a fatal mistake. Instead of running, I froze. The world seemed to move in slow motion as enormous hairy hands suddenly tore through the fabric of my tent like it was tissue paper. I caught a glimpse of massive arms covered in dark, matted fur before I was sent tumbling backward by the force of the attack. As I scrambled to my feet, I found myself face to face with a nightmare come to life. The creature, BigFoot, my mind screamed, though I could hardly believe it, towered over me, easily 8 feet tall. Its massive frame was covered in thick, dark fur, and its face was a terrifying blend of ape and man, with a pronounced brow and a mouth full of yellowed teeth bared in a snarl. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. Yellow and gleaming with a malevolent intelligence, they locked onto mine with predatory focus. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at a killer. "No, please," I managed to choke out, though I knew reasoning with this creature was futile. The Bigfoot's response was another ear-splitting roar, its hot, rancid breath washing over me. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting meat and something musky and alien. I gagged, stumbling backward. That movement seemed to trigger the creature's predatory instinct. It lunged forward with shocking speed for something so large. I felt a searing pain across my chest as its claws raked through my shirt and into my flesh. The pain jolted me into action. Adrenaline surging, I ducked under the creature's massive arm and bolted out of the ruined tent. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear the thunderous footsteps of the Bigfoot in pursuit. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was no one around to hear. "Somebody, please help me." I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on me, its long strides eating up the distance between us. Its yellow eyes were fixed on me, filled with a primal hunger that chilled me to my core. In my panic, I lost my footing on the uneven forest floor. I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for air, I rolled onto my back, knowing with a sickening certainty that this was it. This was how I was going to die. The Bigfoot loomed over me, its massive form blotting out the morning sun. It reached down, enormous hands grasping at me. I could see the dirt under its long, yellowed nails as they inched closer to my face. In a last, desperate move, I kicked out with all my strength, my foot connecting with the creature's knee. It let out a roar of pain and anger, momentarily thrown off balance. That split second was all I needed. I scrambled to my feet and took off running again, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like lead. But fear is a powerful motivator, and somehow I found the strength to keep going. The forest blurred around me as I ran, the sound of the creature's pursuit driving me forward. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt it. All that mattered was escape. Suddenly, the trees thinned, and I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. I skidded to a stop, nearly tumbling over the edge. Far below, I could hear the rush of a river. The momentary pause was all the creature needed to catch up. I turned to face it, knowing I was trapped. The BigFoot emerged from the tree line, its yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory intent. It moved forward slowly now, as if savoring the moment, knowing its prey had nowhere left to run. Time seemed to slow as I stood there, teetering on the edge of the ravine. The creature was barely 10 feet away now, close enough that I could see the saliva dripping from its fangs. In that moment, I made a choice, a desperate, possibly suicidal choice, but the only one left to me. I turned and leapt off the edge of the ravine. The last thing I heard as I plummeted towards the river below was the frustrated roar of the BigFoot, its prize snatched from its grasp at the last moment. Then there was only the rush of wind in my ears and the terrifying sensation of free fall. I hit the icy water with a force that knocked what little air I had left from my lungs. The current immediately swept me away, tumbling me over and over. I fought desperately to reach the surface, my lungs screaming for air. When I finally broke the surface, gasping and spluttering, I was already far downstream from where I'd jumped. The steep banks of the ravine rushed by on either side as the river carried me along. I managed to turn my head, looking back upstream. There, on the edge of the ravine where I'd jumped, I could just make out the dark shape of the BigFoot. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then, as I watched, it turned and melted back into the forest. The river swept me around a bend and the creature disappeared from view. But the image of those yellow eyes remained burned into my mind. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that this wasn't over. Somehow I had survived the initial attack, but the nightmare was far from over. As the current carried me further and further away from my campsite, I clung to consciousness, my body battered and bleeding. The world began to fade around the edges, shock and cold setting in. My last coherent thought before darkness claimed me was a grim realization. I was lost, injured, and alone in the wilderness, with a monster hunting me, and no one would ever believe my story. I don't know how long I was unconscious, drifting in and out as the river carried me downstream. When I finally came to, I found myself washed up on a rocky shore, my body battered and my clothes in tatters. The sun was high in the sky, suggesting several hours had passed since my desperate leap into the river. As I tried to push myself up, pain shot through my chest and arms. I looked down to see deep gashes across my torso where the creature's claws had torn into me. The wounds were caked with dirt and river grime, and I knew infection was a real risk if I didn't clean them soon. "Got to keep moving," I gasped, forcing myself to my feet despite the agony that ripped through me with every movement. I stumbled along the riverbank, my mind reeling as I tried to process what had happened. The attack felt like a nightmare, but the very real pain and the state of my body told me it was all too real. I had been attacked by something that shouldn't exist, something that defied rational explanation. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature emerge from the tree line at any moment. The forest seemed to press in around me, every shadow potentially hiding my pursuer. "It can't have followed me this far," I muttered to myself, trying to quell the rising panic. "It's gone. It has to be gone." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The memory of those yellow eyes, filled with predatory intelligence, told me that this wasn't over. The creature, BigFoot, my mind insisted on calling it, though the name seemed absurdly inadequate for the horror I'd encountered, wasn't going to give up so easily. I don't know how long I walked, time blurring as I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The pain in my chest was a constant, throbbing reminder of my brush with death. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion began to set in, making each step a monumental effort. Just as I was considering stopping to rest, a sound froze me in my tracks. Branches snapping in the forest behind me, too heavy to be caused by any normal wildlife. My heart began to race as I slowly turned to look back the way I'd come. At first I saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the forest, paralleling the river. Something that walked on two legs. "No," I whispered, fear clawing at my throat. "No, no, no." I broke into a run, ignoring the screaming protest of my injured body. Behind me, I heard a guttural roar that sent chills down my spine. The creature had spotted me. The chase was on. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I ran blindly forward. The sound of pursuit behind me was terrifyingly close. Heavy footfalls and the snap of branches as the creature tore through the forest with single-minded determination. My lungs burned, and my vision began to blur from exhaustion and pain. But I kept running, driven by pure primal fear. I knew that if the creature caught me this time, there would be no escape. Suddenly, the trees thinned, and I found myself bursting into a small clearing. For a moment, hope surged through me. Maybe I could find help, or at least somewhere to hide. But as I took in my surroundings, that hope turned to icy dread. I was standing at the edge of another ravine, even steeper than the one I'd jumped from earlier. Far below, I could see jagged rocks jutting out from the cliff face. There would be no surviving a fall from this height. I turned, desperately searching for another way out, but it was too late. The creature burst from the tree line, its massive form blocking any chance of escape back into the forest. In the full light of day, I could see it clearly for the first time, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Muscles rippled under its skin as it moved, displaying a strength that was terrifyingly inhuman. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me with fear. It was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a pronounced brow and a mouth full of yellowed teeth bared in a snarl. And those eyes, those intelligent, hate-filled yellow eyes, were fixed on me with predatory focus. For a moment we stood there, frozen in a tableau of predator and prey. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, the creature charged. In that split second, time seemed to slow. I saw the creature's clawed hands reaching for me, saw the hunger and rage in its eyes. I saw the edge of the ravine behind me, promising certain death. And in that moment, driven by desperation and a will to survive I didn't know I possessed, I made my choice. As the creature's hands were about to close around me, I threw myself to the side, rolling across the ground. The BigFoot's momentum carried it forward, and for one heart-stopping moment it teetered on the edge of the ravine. Our eyes met one last time, and I saw something I never expected in those inhuman orbs: surprise, and perhaps a flicker of fear. Then, with a roar that turned into a scream, the creature plummeted over the edge. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the edge, peering down into the ravine. I caught a glimpse of the creature tumbling down the cliff face, bouncing off rocks, before it disappeared into the mist far below. For a long moment I stood there, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest had fallen silent, as if holding its breath. Then, from far below, I heard a splash. The creature had hit the river at the bottom of the ravine. I stumbled back from the edge, my legs finally giving out. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with exhaustion, pain, and the beginning of shock. Tears streamed down my face as the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed over me. "It's over," I whispered, though a part of me didn't believe it. "It's finally over." But as I sat there trying to gather the strength to move, to find help, a chilling thought crept into my mind. I had no proof of what had happened. No one would believe my story. And somewhere out there at the bottom of that ravine was a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I knew my ordeal wasn't over. It had only just begun. I don't know how long I sat there at the edge of the ravine, my mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. The forest around me had fallen into an eerie silence, as if holding its breath in the wake of the creature's fall. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known with a vengeance. Got to move, I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. With trembling arms, I pushed myself to my feet, nearly collapsing as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I looked down at myself, taking stock of my condition for the first time since the attack. My clothes were in tatters, soaked with river water and my own blood. Deep gashes ran across my chest where the creature's claws had torn into me, and various cuts and bruises covered my arms and legs. I stumbled away from the ravine's edge, each step sending jolts of pain through my battered body. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees and painting the sky in hues of orange and red. I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead me back to civilization. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. As I moved through the forest, my mind kept replaying the attack in vivid detail. The creature's roar, its yellow eyes filled with primal hunger, the impossible strength of its massive hands. It all seemed like a nightmare, but the pain coursing through my body was a constant reminder of its reality. No one's going to believe this, I said aloud, laughing bitterly. The sound echoed through the trees, making me flinch. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself. I walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker around me. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump, my heart racing as I imagined the creature somehow surviving its fall and coming after me again. Rationally, I knew it was impossible, but fear isn't rational. Just as I was beginning to lose hope of finding my way out, I spotted a faint light through the trees. My heart leapt. Could it be a cabin? A ranger station? Anything would be better than spending the night alone in these woods. I quickened my pace, ignoring the protest of my aching muscles. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a building but the glow of a campfire. I could make out the shapes of tents and hear the murmur of voices. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is anyone there? I need help." The voices stopped abruptly and I saw flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, searching for the source of the cry. "Over here!" I shouted, stumbling towards the light. As I broke through the tree line into their campsite, I was met with gasps of shock and horror. 3 people, a man, a woman, and a teenage boy, stared at me with wide eyes. "Oh my God!" the woman exclaimed, her hand flying to her mouth. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? Instead, I felt my legs give out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground. The man rushed forward, catching me before my head hit the dirt. "Easy there, buddy, we've got you." They helped me to a camp chair by the fire, the woman immediately starting to clean my wounds with supplies from a first aid kit. The warmth of the fire and the gentle touch of human hands after the terror I'd experienced was almost overwhelming. "I'm Sarah," the woman said as she worked, her voice calm and soothing. "This is my husband, Mike, and our son, Jason. Can you tell us your name?" "Tom," I managed to croak out. "Tom Taylor." "All right, Tom," Mike said, crouching down beside me. "What happened out there? Were you attacked by a bear?" I laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. I wish it had been a bear. They exchanged worried glances, clearly concerned about my mental state as well as my physical injuries. "It was..." I began, then stopped, shaking my head. "You won't believe me?" "Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself." "Try us," Jason piped up, his young face a mix of fear and curiosity. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "It was BigFoot," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was attacked by BigFoot." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the disbelief in their eyes, mixed with pity. They thought I was crazy or delirious from my injuries. "Tom," Sarah said gently, pausing in her first aid efforts. You've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us. I know what I saw, I interrupted, my voice rising. It was 8 feet tall, covered in fur. It had yellow eyes and it tried to kill me. I only escaped by jumping into a river and then it fell into a ravine. Mike placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression grave. Listen, buddy, you're hurt and you're scared. Whatever happened out there, the important thing is that you're safe now. We'll get you some help, okay? I wanted to argue, to make them understand, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking me. I nodded weakly, letting my eyes close as Sarah continued to clean and bandage my wounds. As I drifted on the edge of consciousness, I heard them talking in hushed voices. Need to get him to a hospital. Shock, probably hallucinating. Call the ranger station in the morning. Their words faded as I slipped into a fitful sleep, my dreams filled with yellow eyes and the echoes of an inhuman roar. When I awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the trees. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the events of the past day came rushing back, along with the pain of my injuries. Sarah was by my side in an instant, offering me water and some painkillers. How are you feeling, Tom? Like I've been hit by a truck, I groaned, accepting the pills gratefully. Mike approached, his face serious. We've decided to break camp and get you to the nearest hospital. It's about a 4-hour hike to where we parked our car, but we'll take it slow. Do you think you can make it? I nodded, though the thought of walking for hours made my body ache even more. As they began to pack up their camp, I sat there, lost in thought. I knew what awaited me. Doctors who wouldn't believe my story, maybe even psychologists questioning my sanity. But I also knew what I had experienced was real. As we prepared to leave, I cast one last look at the forest behind us. Somewhere out there was the ravine where the creature had fallen. Somewhere out there was evidence of its existence. But as I turned to follow my rescuers, I realized with a sinking feeling that I would never be able to find that place again. The truth of what happened would remain hidden in these woods, leaving me with nothing but memories and scars, both physical and mental, as proof of my encounter with the impossible. The journey to the hospital was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Sarah, Mike, and Jason had helped me through the grueling 4-hour hike to their car, each step a reminder of my harrowing encounter. By the time we reached the emergency room, I was barely conscious, the world around me fading in and out of focus. I remember being wheeled into the hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights burning my eyes after so long in the dim forest. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, their voices a cacophony of medical jargon that I couldn't quite grasp. Male, mid-30s, severe lacerations and contusions, possible internal injuries, signs of shock and dehydration. I tried to speak, to tell them what had happened, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. As they cut away what remained of my tattered clothes, I heard gasps of surprise. These wounds. What could have caused this? Some kind of animal attack, maybe? Bears in that area? Their questions faded as darkness overtook me, my body finally surrendering to the trauma it had endured. When I awoke, I found myself in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the room. My chest and arms were heavily bandaged, and an IV drip snaked into my arm. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but the pain that radiated through my body with each breath was a stark reminder of the reality I had faced. A doctor entered the room, her face a mask of professional concern. Mr. Taylor, I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling? Like I've been mauled by a monster, I croaked, my throat dry and raw. She nodded, making a note on her clipboard. You've suffered some severe injuries, Mr. Taylor. Multiple lacerations, bruised ribs, mild concussion. Can you tell me what happened? I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain it caused. You won't believe me, I said, echoing my words to Sarah and her family. Dr. Ramirez's expression softened. Try me, Mr. Taylor. I've seen a lot in my years here. So I told her. I recounted every terrifying detail of my encounter with the creature in the woods. The initial attack at my campsite, the chase through the forest, the final confrontation at the ravine. As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal her skepticism. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Mr. Taylor," she began carefully, "you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes when we're under extreme stress, our minds can—" "Don't," I interrupted, anger flaring despite my exhaustion. "Don't tell me it wasn't real. I know what I saw, what I experienced." Dr. Ramirez sighed, making another note on her clipboard. "I understand you believe that, Mr. Taylor, but the fact is there's no evidence to support the existence of BigFoot. Your injuries, while severe, are consistent with a fall or possibly an encounter with a large predator, like a bear." "A bear?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the sterile hospital room. "A bear didn't do this. It was 8 feet tall, walked on 2 legs, had hands, with claws that could tear through a tent like it was paper. It had yellow eyes that looked at me with intelligence, hatred." The doctor's expression was a mixture of pity and concern. "Mr. Taylor, I'm going to recommend you speak with one of our staff psychologists. Traumatic events can sometimes cause—" "I'm not crazy," I shouted, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through my chest. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." Dr. Ramirez held up her hands in a placating gesture. "No one's saying you're crazy, Mr. Taylor, but you've been through a lot. It's important that we address both your physical and mental well-being." Before I could argue further, a nurse entered the room. "Dr. Ramirez, there's a Sheriff Johnson here to speak with Mr. Taylor." The doctor nodded, turning back to me. "We'll continue this discussion later, Mr. Taylor. Try to rest." As she left, a tall man in a sheriff's uniform entered. His weathered face was set in a grim expression as he approached my bed. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Sheriff Johnson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened in the woods." I nodded, steeling myself for another round of disbelief. "Go ahead, Sheriff." He pulled out a notepad. "Can you tell me, in your own words, what happened out there?" For the 3rd time, I recounted my horrifying experience. As I spoke, I watched the sheriff's face, looking for any sign that he believed me, but his expression remained impassive, giving nothing away. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against his notepad. "That's quite a story, Mr. Taylor," he said finally. "But you don't believe me," I said, resignation creeping into my voice. Sheriff Johnson sighed. "What I believe doesn't matter, son. What matters are the facts. And the fact is we've found no evidence to support your claim of a Bigfoot attack." "No evidence?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my tone. "What about my injuries? The destroyed campsite?" "We found your campsite," the sheriff confirmed. "It was in disarray, but nothing that couldn't be explained by animal activity or the storm that passed through the area that night. As for your injuries," he shrugged. "The doctors say they're consistent with a fall or an encounter with a large predator." I closed my eyes, frustration and despair washing over me. "You think I did this to myself or that I'm lying?" "I think you believe what you're saying," Sheriff Johnson said carefully. "But without evidence, we can't pursue an investigation into a creature that, doesn't exist." As he spoke, a memory flashed in my mind. The massive footprint I'd seen outside my tent that first morning. "The footprint!" I exclaimed. There was a footprint outside my tent, much larger than any human or animal. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "We found no such footprint, Mr. Taylor. The rain likely washed away any tracks." Of course there would be no evidence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was alone in this, with nothing but my memories and my scars to prove what I'd experienced. "Is there anything else you'd like to add to your statement?" Sheriff Johnson asked, his pen poised over his notepad. I shook my head, suddenly feeling very tired. No, there's nothing else." As the sheriff left, I turned my gaze to the window. Outside, I could see the edge of the forest in the distance. Somewhere out there, the creature was still roaming free. And I was here, branded as either a liar or a madman. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, the pain medication dulling my senses, I was plagued by vivid nightmares. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. Massive hands reached for me, and that inhuman roar echoed through my dreams. I woke up multiple times drenched in sweat, my heart racing. In those quiet, dark hours, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the memory of what I'd experienced, and the knowledge that no one believed me, would haunt me for a long time to come. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I made a decision. I had to find proof. Somehow, some way, I had to show the world that what I'd seen was real. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path even more dangerous than the one I'd already traveled. The morning light filtered through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. I lay in bed, my body a patchwork of bandages and bruises, my mind racing with the events of the past day. The disbelief I'd encountered from the doctor and the sheriff had only strengthened my resolve. I knew what I had experienced was real, and I was determined to prove it. Against medical advice, I checked myself out of the hospital. The nurse at the desk gave me a concerned look as I signed the release forms, my hand shaking slightly. "Mr. Taylor, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "Your injuries are severe. You really should stay for observation." I shook my head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "I can't stay here. I need to go back." Her eyes widened. "Back? You mean to the forest? After what happened to you? You don't understand," I said, my voice low and intense. "No one understands. I have to find proof." She opened her mouth to argue further, but something in my expression must have stopped her. With a sigh, she handed me my discharge papers. "Please be careful, Mr. Taylor, and seek medical attention if your condition worsens." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I left the hospital, I could feel the weight of her concerned gaze on my back. Outside, the world seemed too bright, too normal. People went about their day, oblivious to the terror that lurked in the nearby wilderness. I hailed a cab, directing the driver to take me back to the campground where my nightmare had begun. As we drove, the urban landscape gradually gave way to dense forest. My heart rate increased with each passing mile, memories of my encounter flashing through my mind. The cab driver, sensing my unease, tried to make conversation. "Heading out for some camping?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I met his eyes briefly before looking away. "Something like that." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my vague answer. "Beautiful country out here. But you gotta be careful, you know. Lots of wildlife. Bears and such." I almost laughed at the irony. If only he knew. When we reached the campground entrance, I paid the driver and stepped out. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth hit me, bringing with it a wave of anxiety. For a moment, I considered getting back in the cab and leaving this place forever. But the need for vindication, for proof, drove me forward. I made my way to the ranger station, my movements slow and painful. Ranger Johnson was behind the counter, his eyes widening in surprise as he recognized me. "Mr. Taylor?" he said, coming around the counter. "What are you doing back here? We heard about your, accident." I could hear the skepticism in his voice when he said, "accident." "I need to go back to my campsite," I said, cutting straight to the point. Ranger Johnson's brow furrowed. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, son. You're in no condition to be out in the woods. Besides, we've already cleared out your site. There's nothing left there." "Please," I insisted, desperation creeping into my voice. I left something important. I need to find it." He studied me for a long moment, concern and doubt warring in his expression. Finally, he sighed. All right, but I'm coming with you, and we're taking the ATV. You're in no shape for a hike. Relief washed over me. Thank you, I said, meaning it. The ride to my former campsite was tense. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Ranger Johnson kept casting worried glances my way, clearly regretting his decision to bring me out here. When we arrived at the clearing where my tent had once stood, I felt a chill run down my spine. The area had been cleared, as the ranger had said. There was no sign of the destruction I had witnessed, no evidence of the terror I had experienced. I stumbled forward, my eyes scanning the ground desperately. It has to be here, I muttered. There has to be something. Mr. Taylor, Ranger Johnson said, his voice gentle but firm. There's nothing here. Whatever you think happened. I know what happened, I snapped, whirling to face him. The sudden movement sent a jolt of pain through my injured body, and I staggered. The ranger caught me before I could fall. Easy there. Look, I understand you've been through something traumatic, but this isn't the way to deal with it. Let me take you back. There are people who can help. No, I interrupted, pulling away from him. You don't understand. It was here. It was real. The footprint, the claw marks, they have to be here somewhere. I moved further into the clearing, my eyes darting frantically from tree to tree, searching for any sign of the creature's presence. But the forest remained stubbornly, infuriatingly normal. As I reached the edge of the clearing, a flicker of movement in the underbrush caught my eye. My heart leapt into my throat. Could it be? Had the creature returned? There, I shouted, pointing. Did you see that? Ranger Johnson was at my side in an instant, his hand on his holstered weapon. See what, Mr. Taylor, there's nothing there. But I was already moving, pushing through the undergrowth towards where I had seen the movement. Branches whipped at my face, reopening barely healed cuts. I could hear the ranger calling after me, his voice tinged with alarm, but I ignored him. I burst into another small clearing, my eyes wild, searching for any sign of the creature. But there was nothing, just more trees, more undergrowth. No massive footprints, no signs of a struggle. Nothing to prove that my encounter had been real. As the adrenaline faded, the pain of my injuries reasserted itself with a vengeance. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by a wave of despair and frustration. Ranger Johnson caught up to me, out of breath and clearly upset. Mr. Taylor, this has gone far enough. I'm taking you back now. I didn't resist as he helped me to my feet and led me back to the ATV. The ride back to the ranger station passed in a blur of green shadows and unspoken tension. As we pulled up to the station, I saw a familiar vehicle parked out front. Sheriff Johnson stepped out, his face grim as he approached us. Tom, he said, his voice a mixture of concern and exasperation. I got a call from the hospital. They're worried about you, son, and frankly, so am I. I looked from the sheriff to the ranger, seeing the same expression of pity and disbelief on both their faces. In that moment, I realized the futility of my search. There would be no proof, no vindication. The truth of what I had experienced would remain hidden in the depths of the forest, known only to me and the creature that had nearly taken my life. As the sheriff gently but firmly led me to his car, I cast one last look at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw a flash of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. The forest had reclaimed its secrets, leaving me alone with my memories and the knowledge that somewhere out there, hidden from the world, a monster still roamed free. The ride back to town in Sheriff Johnson's patrol car was silent and tense. I could feel his concerned glances, but I kept my eyes fixed on the passing forest, searching the shadows between the trees. As we pulled into the small town of Pine Creek, the sheriff finally broke the silence. Tom, I'm taking you to see Dr. Simmons. He's a good man, a psychiatrist. He can help you process what happened out there. I turned to him, anger flaring despite my exhaustion. I don't need a psychiatrist. I need someone to believe me. The sheriff sighed, parking the car in front of a small nondescript building. Son, I want to believe you, but you have to understand how this sounds. Bigfoot? It's just not possible. I didn't respond as we entered the building. Dr. Simmons was waiting for us, a kind-faced man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He ushered us into his office, a cozy room lined with bookshelves. Mr. Taylor, he said, his voice gentle, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Can you tell me about it? For what felt like the 100th time, I recounted my encounter with the creature. As I spoke, I could see the doubt in Dr. Simmons's eyes, mirroring the expressions I'd seen on the faces of everyone else I'd told. When I finished, Dr. Simmons leaned forward in his chair. Tom, what you're describing is a very vivid and terrifying experience. But it's important to understand that our minds can play tricks on us, especially in high-stress situations. I stood up abruptly, ignoring the pain that shot through my body. This wasn't a trick of the mind. It was real. I felt its breath on my face, its claws tearing into my skin. How can you sit there and tell me it wasn't real? Tom, please, Sheriff Johnson said, rising as well. Let's just... But I was already moving towards the door. I'm done talking. I'm done trying to convince people. I know what I saw, what I experienced. I stormed out of the office, ignoring their calls for me to come back. The cool evening air hit me as I stepped outside, and I realized I had no idea where to go. My car was still at the campground, and I had no money for a hotel. As I stood there, lost and alone, a familiar scent hit my nostrils. That same musky alien odor I'd smelled in the forest. My heart began to race as I scanned the street, looking for the source. There, across the road, at the edge of the forest that bordered the town, a flash of movement, a glimpse of dark fur disappearing behind a tree. Without thinking, I began to run. I heard Sheriff Johnson calling after me, but his voice faded as I plunged into the forest. The pain of my injuries was forgotten, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I chased after the creature. The forest was growing dark, the last light of day fading rapidly. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear something moving ahead of me, just out of sight. Come back, I shouted, my voice hoarse. Show yourself. Suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. I skidded to a stop, my eyes widening in horror. There, on the other side of the clearing, stood the creature. In the fading light, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a terrifying blend of ape and man, with a pronounced brow and a mouth full of yellowed teeth. And those eyes, those intelligent, hate-filled yellow eyes that had haunted my nightmares. For a moment we stood there, predator and prey, locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, the creature charged. I turned to run, but my injured body betrayed me. I stumbled, falling hard on the forest floor. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps getting closer, feel the ground trembling with each stride. Rolling onto my back, I saw the Bigfoot looming over me, its massive form blotting out what little light remained. Its hot, rancid breath washed over me as it leaned in close, those terrible yellow eyes boring into mine. I could see the intelligence in those eyes, the malevolent awareness that told me this was no mere animal. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our world. As its enormous hand reached for me, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached into my pocket, grasping the small can of bear spray I'd taken from the ranger station. With a silent prayer, I aimed it at the creature's face and pressed the button. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The Bigfoot reared back with a roar of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very trees. It clawed at its eyes, stumbling backward. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature was thrashing about, its agonized roars echoing through the forest. I knew this was my only chance. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature's howls of rage, growing more distant as I put as much distance between us as possible. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but still I pushed on. Finally, I burst out of the tree line, finding myself on the outskirts of town. Lights from nearby houses beckoned, promising safety and normalcy, but as I staggered towards them, I knew that normalcy was something I might never experience again. As I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air, I heard shouts and running footsteps. Sheriff Johnson's face swam into view, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Tom, my God, what happened? Where have you been?" I tried to speak, to tell him about the encounter, but no words would come. As darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, I saw the sheriff turn to someone else, his voice urgent. "Call an ambulance, now." As I slipped into unconsciousness, my last thought was of those terrible yellow eyes. I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until one of us was dead. The true horror of my situation was only just beginning to unfold. I awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling my nostrils. For a moment I thought I was back in the first hospital, that everything that had happened since was just a terrible nightmare. But as I tried to move, the sharp pain that shot through my body told me otherwise. "Easy there, Mr. Taylor," a nurse said, gently pushing me back onto the bed. "You've been through quite an ordeal." I wanted to laugh at the understatement, but it came out as more of a groan. "Where am I?" I managed to croak out. "Pine Creek General Hospital," she replied, checking my vitals. "Sheriff Johnson brought you in last night. You were in pretty bad shape." Last night. The memories came flooding back. The chase through the forest, the terrifying encounter with the creature, my desperate escape. I tried to sit up again, ignoring the pain. "I need to talk to Sheriff Johnson," I said urgently. "He needs to know what happened." The nurse gave me a sympathetic look. "The sheriff will be by later to take your statement. For now, you need to rest." Before I could argue further, the door opened and Dr. Simmons walked in, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mr. Taylor," he said, approaching the bed, "I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied honestly. "But that doesn't matter. Doctor, you have to listen to me. It's real. The creature, BigFoot, it's real. I saw it again last night." Dr. Simmons exchanged a glance with the nurse, who quietly excused herself from the room. He pulled up a chair next to my bed, his expression grave. "Tom," he said gently, "I understand you believe what you're saying, but we found you collapsed on the street, severely dehydrated and with your previous injuries aggravated. You were delirious, talking about monsters and yellow eyes. It's clear you're suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress." I shook my head vehemently, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "No, you don't understand. I'm not delusional. I saw it. It was right there in front of me. I used bear spray on it. That's how I got away." Dr. Simmons leaned forward, his voice low and soothing. "Tom, we didn't find any evidence of a large creature in the area where you were found. No footprints, no fur, nothing. And there was no trace of bear spray on your clothes or hands." I felt a chill run down my spine. How was that possible? I remembered the spray, remembered the creature's roar of pain. But if there was no evidence... "No," I whispered, more to myself than to Dr. Simmons. "No, it was real. I know it was real." The doctor placed a hand on my arm. "I'd like you to consider staying here for a few days, Tom. We can help you work through this trauma, help you understand what you've experienced." I pulled away from his touch, anger and frustration bubbling up inside me. I don't need to work through anything. I need people to believe me. I need someone to go out there and find that thing before it hurts someone else. Dr. Simmons opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sheriff Johnson entered, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Tom," he said, nodding to Dr. Simmons. "Good to see you awake. Mind if I ask you a few questions about last night?" "Sheriff," I said, seizing the opportunity, "you have to listen to me. The creature, it's still out there. I saw it last night in the woods at the edge of town. We need to organize a search party, warn people. The sheriff held up a hand, cutting me off. Slow down, son. Why don't you start from the beginning? Tell me exactly what happened after you left Dr. Simmons's office. So I did. I recounted every detail of my encounter in the forest. The chase, the clearing, the terrifying standoff with the creature. I described its appearance, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it had charged at me. I told them about the bear spray, about my desperate flight through the woods. As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. By the time I finished, Sheriff Johnson was shaking his head. "Tom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We searched the area where we found you. There was no sign of any large animal, let alone a Bigfoot. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing." "But that's impossible," I insisted. "It was there. I saw it, I felt it. Its breath on my face, its weight as it pinned me down." I trailed off, realizing how crazy I must sound. But I knew what I had experienced. It had been real, every terrifying second of it. Dr. Simmons cleared his throat. "Sheriff, given Mr. Taylor's condition and the nature of his claims, I'd like to recommend a psychological evaluation." The words hit me like a physical blow. They thought I was crazy. Despite everything I'd been through, despite the very real injuries I'd sustained, they believed I was delusional. "No," I said, my voice rising. "No, I don't need a psychological evaluation. I need someone to believe me. I need someone to do something before that thing kills someone." I tried to get out of bed, ignoring the pain that shot through my body. Sheriff Johnson moved quickly, gently but firmly, pushing me back down. "Easy, Tom," he said. "You're in no condition to be moving around. Look, why don't you get some rest? We can talk more later when you're feeling better." As they left the room, I could hear them talking in low voices just outside the door. Need to keep him under observation. Possible danger to himself. Trauma-induced delusions. I lay there staring at the ceiling, a feeling of hopelessness washing over me. They didn't believe me. No one believed me. And somewhere out there, in the forests surrounding Pine Creek, a monster was roaming free. As night fell, casting long shadows across my hospital room, I made a decision. If no one would believe me, if no one would help me, then I would have to take matters into my own hands. I had to find proof, irrefutable evidence of the creature's existence. Even as I formed this plan, a part of me knew it was madness. Going back into those woods, facing that creature again. It was a death wish. But what choice did I have? I couldn't let it hurt anyone else. I couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd failed to stop it when I had the chance. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, my dreams were filled with yellow eyes and the echoes of an inhuman roar. Little did I know, the true nightmare was yet to come. Tom Taylor, a resident of Pine Creek, claims to have been attacked by the legendary creature known as Bigfoot. However, local authorities say there is no evidence to support his claims. Sheriff Johnson had this to say. The screen cut to Sheriff Johnson, looking uncomfortable in front of the cameras. "While we take all reports seriously, we have found no concrete evidence to support Mr. Taylor's claims. We urge the public to remain calm and to report any unusual sightings to the proper authorities." I clicked off the TV, a wave of despair washing over me. They were painting me as a liar or a lunatic. Everything I had experienced, all the terror and pain, was being dismissed as a hoax or a delusion. Dr. Simmons entered the room, his face grave. "Tom, I think we need to talk about what's happening." I nodded, too tired to argue. "They think I'm crazy, don't they? Or that I made it all up for attention?" He sat down beside my bed, his voice gentle. "I know you believe what you experienced was real, but you have to understand how it sounds to others. Bigfoot is a myth, a legend. There's never been any scientific evidence to support its existence." "I know what I saw," I insisted, but my voice lacked conviction. The constant disbelief, the skepticism in everyone's eyes was starting to wear me down. Dr. Simmons leaned forward. "Tom, I'd like you to consider staying here for a while longer. We have excellent psychiatric facilities. We can help you work through this trauma. understand what really happened to you in those woods." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. They wanted to commit me. They thought I was insane. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in. "Dr. Simmons, there are some people here to see Mr. Taylor. They say they're from a cryptozoology society." I perked up at this. Finally, someone who might believe me. But Dr. Simmons shook his head. "I don't think that's a good idea right now. Mr. Taylor needs rest, not more excitement." As the nurse left, I turned to Dr. Simmons. "Please, let me talk to them. They might be able to help prove what I saw was real." He sighed, clearly conflicted. "Tom, engaging with these people, it's not going to help your situation. It will only reinforce these beliefs." "Beliefs?" I repeated, anger flaring. "This isn't about belief. It's about what I experienced, what I know to be true." But even as I said the words, a small seed of doubt had begun to take root. Was it possible? Could my mind have somehow conjured up this entire experience? No. I pushed the thought away. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The terror had been real. The pain had been real. The creature had been real. As night fell, I found myself alone in my room, the hospital quiet around me. I stared out the window at the distant tree line, knowing that somewhere out there the creature was still roaming free. My phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged me in a social media post. With a sense of dread, I opened it. It was a meme. My face, taken from the news report, photoshopped onto a ridiculous Bigfoot costume. The caption read, "Pine Creek's very own Bigfoot hunter. Watch out, Sasquatch." I scrolled through the comments, each one a knife to my already battered psyche. Attention seeker much? Probably just saw a bear and freaked out, lol. This guy needs help, seriously. I threw the phone aside, a wave of hopelessness washing over me. No one believed me. I had become a joke, a cautionary tale, the town crazy who thought he saw Bigfoot. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face the ridicule, the disbelief, the pitying looks. As soon as I was discharged, I would leave Pine Creek. Leave behind the forest, the memories, the terror. But even as I formed this plan, I knew the truth. I could leave Pine Creek, but I could never escape what had happened to me. The memory of those yellow eyes, the feel of those massive hands, the sound of that inhuman roar. They would stay with me forever. And somewhere out there in the deep, dark woods, a creature that shouldn't exist was still roaming free. A creature that now knew the taste of human fear, the thrill of the hunt. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, my last thought was a chilling realization. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As our car wound its way through the dense Pennsylvania forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, ready to snatch us from the safety of our vehicle. I'm Emily Williams, and this was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my best friends, Sarah and Mike. But from the moment we entered these woods, a sense of unease had settled in the pit of my stomach. "Hey, Em, you okay back there?" Sarah called from the driver's seat, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "You've been awfully quiet." I forced a smile, trying to push away the creeping dread. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just taking in the scenery, you know." Mike turned around in the passenger seat, his usual goofy grin plastered across his face. "Come on, Emily. Where's your sense of adventure? This weekend is going to be epic." I nodded, not wanting to dampen their spirits with my irrational fears. After all, we'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. But as we delved deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to grow longer, and the silence more oppressive. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, we pulled into the remote campsite. As I stepped out of the car, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, But underneath it all, there was something else. Something musky, wild. "All right, team." Mike clapped his hands together, startling me out of my thoughts. "Let's get this camp set up before it gets dark." We busied ourselves with unloading the car and setting up our tents. The physical activity helped distract me from my growing unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd pause and scan the tree line, half expecting to see a pair of eyes glowing in the shadows. As the sun began to set, we gathered around the campfire. The crackling flames did little to mask the eerie silence that had fallen over the woods. No chirping crickets, no hooting owls. Just the occasional snap of a twig in the darkness that made me jump. "Earth to Emily." Sarah waved her hand in front of my face. "You're a million miles away. What's going on?" I sighed, feeling foolish. "I don't know. Something just feels off. Don't you think it's too quiet out here?" Mike laughed, taking a swig from his beer. "That's the whole point, Em. We're miles from civilization. No traffic, no sirens, no noisy neighbors. Just us and Mother Nature." "I guess," I mumbled, not convinced. "It's probably just me being paranoid." Sarah reached out and squeezed my hand. "Hey, it's okay. The woods can be creepy at night, especially if you're not used to it. But we're safe here. Nothing to worry about." I nodded, trying to let their reassurances calm me. We spent the next few hours chatting and laughing around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. For a while, I almost forgot about my earlier apprehension. As the fire died down to embers, Mike stood up and stretched. "Well, I don't know about you ladies, but I'm beat. Think I'll turn in for the night?" Sarah yawned in agreement. "Same here. You coming, Em?" I glanced at the dark forest surrounding us, then back at my friends. "Yeah, just give me a minute. I want to enjoy the stars for a bit longer." They nodded and retreated to their respective tents, leaving me alone by the dying fire. I tilted my head back, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars visible through the canopy of trees. It was beautiful, I had to admit. So different from the light-polluted skies of the city. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sound in the oppressive silence of the forest. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, causing me to jump and spill my drink. My heart raced as I peered into the gloom, trying to make out any shapes in the shadows between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I laughed nervously, shaking my head at my own paranoia. "Get it together, Emily," I muttered to myself. "It's just an animal or something." Still, I couldn't quite convince myself that everything was normal. I quickly doused the remaining embers of the fire and hurried to my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. As I snuggled into my sleeping bag, I tried to ignore the goosebumps that prickled my skin as an owl finally broke the silence with a haunting hoot. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, Sarah's soft snores from the neighboring tent, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something that made my heart race and my palms sweat. Just before drifting off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed too heavy to belong to any normal forest creature. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound faded away, leaving me to wonder if it had been real or just a product of my overactive imagination. As sleep finally claimed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that our peaceful camping trip was about to take a terrifying turn. Little did I know, the true horror was yet to come, waiting for us in the depths of the Pennsylvania wilderness. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The soft glow of moonlight filtered through the thin fabric of my tent, casting eerie shadows. Then it all came rushing back. The camping trip, the unsettling feeling in the woods, the strange noises. But something was different now. The footsteps I thought I'd imagined before falling asleep were back, and they were unmistakably real. Heavy, deliberate steps circled our campsite, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the footsteps from my dreams were actually happening. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to track the movement outside. Whatever it was big. Much bigger than a deer or even a bear. The footsteps paused near my tent, and I could hear deep, ragged breathing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a musky, animalistic scent seeped through the tent fabric. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled towards the tent entrance. My hands trembled as I reached for the zipper. Part of me screamed to stay put, to hide, but curiosity and fear propelled me forward. I had to know what was out there. I peered out of my tent and my blood ran cold. There, moving between the trees, was a massive, shadowy figure. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its movements were both powerful and strangely fluid for something so large. This was no bear, no known animal. My mind reeled, struggling to process what I was seeing. As if sensing my gaze, the creature turned. Time seemed to stand still as our eyes met. I saw Bigfoot's eyes glaring at me through the darkness, reflecting the moonlight with an eerie amber glow. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the legends were true. Bigfoot was real, and it was right here in our campsite. Before I could react, before I could even draw breath to scream, it struck. The creature's massive hand tore through my tent like it was tissue paper. I scrambled backward, my sleeping bag tangling around my legs as I tried desperately to get away. The foul stench of its breath filled my nostrils, and its growl vibrated through my entire body. "Sarah! Mike!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Wake up! Help!" I heard confused shouts from their tents, but they seemed so far away. The creature's enormous form blocked the entrance to my shredded tent. Its eyes, now that I could see them up close, held no hint of humanity or intelligence. Just primal, animalistic hunger. As it reached for me, I kicked out wildly, my foot connecting with something solid. The creature let out a roar of pain or anger, I couldn't tell which, and momentarily withdrew its arm. I seized the opportunity, diving through the hole it had created in my tent. The cool night air hit me like a slap as I tumbled onto the forest floor. I could hear Sarah and Mike shouting in confusion and fear, but I couldn't spare a moment to look for them. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my bare feet slipping on the damp leaves as I plunged into the darkness of the forest. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roar and the sound of my friend's screams. Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. My feet were cut and bruised from running barefoot through the forest. I had scratches all over my arms and face from the branches I'd run through. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing weight of fear and uncertainty. I sat there in that clearing for what felt like hours, jumping at every little sound. Every rustle of leaves could be that creature coming back for me. Every shadow seemed to move, to reach out with clawed hands. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to find Sarah and Mike. If they were hurt, or worse, because I'd run away, I'd never forgive myself. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. My whole body ached, and exhaustion weighed heavily on me. But the thought of my friends gave me strength. I had to know what happened to them. I started walking, trying to retrace my steps from the night before. Everything looked different in the pale morning light. Had I run past that oddly shaped tree? Was this the same stream I'd splashed through in my panic? As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Bigfoot. I had seen Bigfoot. The creature from campfire stories and blurry photographs was real, and it was hostile. But who would believe me? The scratches and bruises on my body could have come from anything. I had no proof of what I'd seen. Finally, after what seemed like hours of wandering, I heard voices in the distance. My heart leaped with hope. Could it be Sarah and Mike? I quickened my pace, ignoring the pain in my feet. As I broke through a line of trees, I saw our campsite. Relief flooded through me as I spotted Sarah and Mike, looking tired and worried, but very much alive. "Emily!" Sarah cried out when she saw me. She ran towards me, enveloping me in a tight hug. "Oh my God, where have you been? We've been so worried." Mike joined us, his face a mix of relief and concern. "What happened to you? You look like you've been through hell." I opened my mouth to tell them everything, about the creature, the attack, my terrifying night in the forest. But as I looked at their concerned faces, I hesitated. How could I explain what had happened? Would they even believe me? As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a deceptively peaceful light over our campsite, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. Somehow I had to make them understand the danger we were in, because I knew, with chilling certainty, that somewhere out there in the forest, BigFoot was still lurking, and I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done with us yet. As dawn broke, I stumbled out of my shredded tent, my whole body aching from the night's terrifying ordeal. The morning light cast an eerily peaceful glow over our campsite, a stark contrast to the horror I had experienced just hours ago. Sarah and Mike were already up, concern etched on their faces as they took in my disheveled appearance. "Emily, what on earth happened to you?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with worry. "We heard screaming last night, but by the time we got out of our tents, you were gone." I opened my mouth, then closed it again, unsure of how to begin. How could I explain what I'd seen? The words, "BigFoot attack," sounded ridiculous even in my own mind. But I had to try. They needed to know the danger we were in. "You guys," I started, my voice shaking. "Something attacked our camp last night. Something big." Mike frowned, looking around the campsite. "A bear, maybe? But I don't see any signs of—" "No," I interrupted, my hands trembling as I pushed my tangled hair out of my face. "It wasn't a bear. It was— God, you're going to think I'm crazy. But it was BigFoot." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah and Mike exchanged a look that I couldn't quite decipher. Concern, disbelief, maybe even a hint of fear. "BigFoot," Mike repeated slowly, as if testing out the word. Are you sure you weren't just having a nightmare?" I felt a flash of frustration. "Look at me." I gestured to my torn clothes, the scratches on my arms and legs. "Look at my tent. Does this look like a nightmare to you?" Sarah stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my arm. Okay. Let's all calm down. Emily, why don't you tell us exactly what happened?" Taking a deep breath, I recounted the events of the night, the heavy footsteps, the massive figure I'd seen, the glowing eyes, and the attack on my tent. As I spoke, I could see the doubt clouding their eyes, but I pressed on. "I know it sounds insane," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "But I swear to you, it was real. We're in danger here. We need to leave." Mike shook his head, looking troubled. "Emily, I believe that you believe what you saw, but BigFoot, come on, there's got to be a rational explanation." "Like what?" I demanded, anger and fear making my voice rise. "What rational explanation is there for this?" I gestured to my ruined tent. "Maybe it was a bear," Sarah suggested gently. "You were scared? It was dark. It's easy for the mind to play tricks." "It wasn't a bear," I shouted, then immediately regretted my outburst as I saw them both flinch. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Look, I know how it sounds, but please, you have to believe me. We're not safe here." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, let's look around, all right? If there really was something big out there, there should be some evidence." Nodding eagerly, I led them around our campsite. My hands shook as I pointed out the massive footprints in the soft earth near my tent. "See? Look at the size of these. No bear made these prints." Sarah knelt down, examining the impressions. "They are big," she admitted. "But the ground's pretty soft here. They could be distorted." I moved on, showing them the claw marks on the trees nearby, the broken branches that were far too high for any normal animal to reach. But for every piece of evidence I presented, they seemed to have a rational explanation. The claw marks could be old bear scratches. The broken branches could have been caused by a storm we'd had last week. As we completed our circuit of the campsite, I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the footprints were leading deeper into the woods away from our campsite and towards a nearby hiking trail. The creature was still out there, possibly hunting for its next victim. "We have to warn someone," I said urgently. "There are hikers who use that trail. They could be in danger." Mike shook his head, looking exasperated. "Emily, listen to yourself. We can't go around scaring people with stories about Bigfoot. There's no proof." "No proof?" I repeated incredulously. "What about all of this?" I gestured around wildly at the campsite. Sarah stepped between us, her voice soothing. We're not saying nothing happened. Clearly you had a frightening experience. But jumping to conclusions about Bigfoot, it's a bit much, don't you think?" I stared at them both, a sinking feeling in my stomach as I realized they truly didn't believe me. The forest seemed to mock me with its peaceful morning chorus, as if the night's terror had never happened. Birds chirped cheerfully, squirrels scampered up trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It all seemed so normal, so at odds with the lingering fear that gripped my heart. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice small and defeated. Mike clapped his hands together, forcing a cheerful tone. "Well, we came out here for a camping trip, didn't we? Let's not let one bad night ruin the whole weekend. How about we make some breakfast and then hit that hiking trail?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "The trail? But that's where we'll get some great views and maybe spot some actual wildlife," Sarah cut in smoothly. "Come on, Em. Some fresh air and exercise will do you good. Help take your mind off things." I wanted to argue further, to make them understand the danger we were in. But the looks on their faces told me it was useless. They had already made up their minds that I was overreacting, maybe even hallucinating from fear. As Sarah and Mike bustled about, preparing breakfast and chatting as if nothing had happened, I sat on a log, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The weight of what I'd experienced, coupled with my friend's disbelief, felt crushing. I gazed at the tree line, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any hint that the creature was still out there. The forest looked back, serene and innocent in the morning light. But I knew better now. I knew what lurked in its depths. As we prepared to set out on our hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. The creature was out there, I was sure of it, and something told me that our paths would cross again before this trip was over. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to follow Sarah and Mike as they headed towards the trail. Little did they know, we were walking straight into the hunting grounds of a monster they didn't believe existed. And I, the only one who knew the truth, was powerless to stop it. The forest path stretched before us, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy overhead. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. But now, every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential danger. My eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of the creature I knew was out there. "Emily, you okay?" Sarah's voice broke through my vigilant haze. "You're awfully quiet." I forced a smile, trying to appear more relaxed than I felt. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just taking in the scenery." Mike, walking ahead of us, turned and grinned. "That's the spirit. See? I told you this hike would do you good. Clear your head a bit." If only they knew how impossible that was. My head was anything but clear. It was a swirling mess of fear, frustration, and hyper-awareness. Every fern that brushed against my leg made me flinch. Every snapping twig under our feet caused my heart to race. We continued along the trail, Mike enthusiastically pointing out various plants and birds. Sarah tried to engage me in conversation, but my responses were distracted and brief. How could I focus on small talk when I knew what was lurking in these woods? As we rounded a bend in the trail, a gust of wind brought a familiar scent, that same musky odor from the night before. I froze, my body tensing instinctively. "Guys," I whispered urgently, "do Do you smell that? Sarah and Mike paused, sniffing the air. Smell what? Mike asked, looking confused. That musky smell, like wet fur and... I trailed off, realizing how crazy I must sound. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with concern. I don't smell anything unusual, just the forest. I wanted to scream in frustration. How could they not smell it? It was so strong, so distinct. But I bit my tongue, not wanting to seem even more unhinged in their eyes. We pressed on, but now I was even more on edge. The scent lingered, growing stronger as we continued down the trail. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. I knew with sickening certainty that Bigfoot had found another victim. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix of human terror and animalistic rage. "What the hell was that?" Mike exclaimed, his face pale. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now!" But before we could move, another scream pierced the air, closer this time. Without thinking, I started running towards the sound, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Emily, wait!" Sarah called after me, but I couldn't stop. Someone was in danger, and I was the only one who knew what they were facing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I ran. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more terrifying. Behind me, I could hear Sarah and Mike struggling to keep up, calling my name. As we entered a small clearing, the sight before us made me gag. Torn camping gear was strewn about, and leaves were stained with splashes of red. The musky odor was overwhelming here, mixed with the metallic scent of blood. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth in horror. Mike stepped forward, his face ashen. What happened here?" I scanned the clearing, my eyes wide with fear. "It was here," I said, my voice shaking. "Bigfoot. It attacked someone." "Emily, stop it," Mike snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. This has to be a bear attack or something." But even as he said it, we all knew it wasn't true. The destruction around us was too extensive, too violent for a normal animal. And there, at the edge of the clearing, was a footprint, massive and unmistakably humanoid. "Do you believe me now?" I asked, pointing at the print. Before they could respond, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. Time seemed to stand still as Bigfoot emerged from the shadows, its massive form blocking out the sun. It was even more terrifying in the daylight, over 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown fur, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. I could hear my friend's panicked breathing behind me as the creature's eyes locked onto mine. They were filled with a primal hunger that made my blood run cold. "Don't move," I whispered, barely breathing. For a moment, we were frozen in a tableau of terror. 3 humans face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, Bigfoot charged. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Sarah and Mike towards the trail. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footsteps gaining ground with each passing second. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept me going. "This way," Mike yelled, veering off the trail onto a narrower path. We followed, gasping for air as we pushed ourselves harder. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and immediately regretted it. Bigfoot was closer than I thought, its massive form barreling through the forest with terrifying speed. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled, crying out in pain. Without hesitation, I grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Come on," I urged, half dragging her along. We burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep ravine. The path ended abruptly at the cliff's edge. "We're trapped," Sarah cried, her voice tinged with hysteria. The sound of splintering wood behind us announced Bigfoot's arrival. It emerged from the forest, its chest heaving, eyes blazing with murderous intent. "What do we do?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked from the creature to the ravine and back again, my mind racing. There was no way we could outrun it, no way we could fight it. We were cornered, with no escape in sight. As Bigfoot took a menacing step forward, a plan, desperate and dangerous, formed in my mind. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was our only chance. When I say go, I whispered to Sarah and Mike, we jump. What? Sarah hissed, her eyes wide with fear. Trust me, I pleaded, watching as the creature tensed, preparing to charge. Bigfoot roared, the sound reverberating through my very bones. It lunged forward, massive arms outstretched to grab us. Now, I screamed, grabbing my friend's hands and leaping off the cliff just as Bigfoot's claws slashed through the air where we had been standing. As we plummeted towards the trees below, the creature's frustrated roar echoed above us. The last thing I saw before the branches engulfed us was Bigfoot's massive form silhouetted against the sky, a testament to the nightmare we had narrowly escaped. Our terrifying fall and what awaited us at the bottom of the ravine were challenges for another moment. For now we had survived, but I knew with chilling certainty that our ordeal was far from over. Somewhere above us, Bigfoot was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it had finished what it started. The world spun around me as we tumbled down the ravine, branches whipping past and leaves blurring into a green haze. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out Sarah and Mike's screams. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once, and I couldn't tell if we'd been falling for seconds or hours. Suddenly the ground rushed up to meet us. I hit hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. The forest canopy above swayed dizzily, sunlight filtering through in patches. Sarah? Mike? I croaked, struggling to sit up. My whole body ached, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my face from a cut on my forehead. A groan to my left answered me. I'm here, Sarah's voice came weakly. Mike? Another groan, this time from my right. Yeah, Mike mumbled. I'm alive, I think. Slowly, painfully, we gathered ourselves. We were battered and bruised, but miraculously, nothing seemed to be broken. The thick underbrush at the bottom of the ravine had cushioned our fall somewhat. That was insane, Mike said, wincing as he touched a nasty-looking gash on his arm. We could have died. We would have died if we'd stayed up there, I countered, my eyes darting nervously to the top of the ravine. There was no sign of Bigfoot, but that didn't mean it wasn't still out there, hunting us. Sarah was shaking, leaves and twigs tangled in her hair. I can't believe it, she whispered. That thing, it was real. Emily, you were right. I'm so sorry we didn't believe you. I wanted to feel vindicated, but the fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins left no room for it. We need to move, I said urgently. It might find a way down here. We helped each other up, our movements slow and pained. The ravine stretched out before us, a narrow corridor of trees and undergrowth. To our left, I could hear the faint sound of running water. There might be a stream that way, I said, pointing. If we follow it, it could lead us out of the forest. Mike nodded grimly. Good thinking. Let's go. We set off, moving as quickly as our battered bodies would allow. The terrain was rough, with slippery rocks and tangled roots threatening to trip us at every step. But the fear of what might be following us kept us going. As we walked, I couldn't shake the image of Bigfoot's face from my mind. Those eyes filled with primal hunger and intelligence. The way it had moved, so powerful and yet so agile for its size. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. What do you think it wants? Sarah asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. I shook my head. I don't know. Food, maybe? Territory? Whatever it is, it's clear we're not welcome here. Mike, who had been leading our little group, suddenly stopped. Guys, he said, his voice tight with fear. Look. Ahead of us, the ravine opened up into a small clearing. Sunlight streamed down, illuminating a scene that made my blood run cold. The ground was torn up, trees uprooted and scattered like matchsticks. And there, in the center of the destruction, was a massive, crude shelter made of broken branches and leaves. "Is that its lair?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. Time seemed to stand still as Bigfoot emerged from the shadows, its massive form blocking out the sun. It was even more terrifying up close, over 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown fur, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. I could hear my friend's panicked breathing behind me as the creature's eyes locked onto mine. They were filled with a primal hunger that made my blood run cold. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was no misunderstood creature. This was a predator, and we were its prey. "Don't move," I whispered, barely breathing. For a moment, we were frozen in a tableau of terror. 3 humans face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, Bigfoot charged. Time seemed to stand still as the creature's massive form blocked out the sun. I could hear my friend's panicked breathing behind me as Bigfoot's eyes locked onto mine, filled with primal hunger. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Sarah and Mike towards the edge of the clearing. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footsteps gaining ground with each passing second. The forest floor trembled beneath my feet as Bigfoot charged, its roar drowning out our screams. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as its massive arms swung where I had been standing just a moment before. The creature's foul breath washed over me, and I gagged, scrambling to my feet. "This way!" Mike yelled, veering off towards a dense thicket of trees. Sarah and I followed, gasping for air as we pushed ourselves harder. But Bigfoot was faster, more agile in this terrain than we could ever be. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind us, gaining ground with every step. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled, crying out in pain. I turned back to help her, but before I could reach her, Bigfoot was there. The sickening crunch of bones filled the air as the creature grabbed Sarah, tossing her aside like a rag doll. "No!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror and grief. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "We can't help her. We have to go." Tears blurred my vision as we ran, the sound of Bigfoot's roars echoing through the forest. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the fear of what was behind me kept me going. We burst out of the tree line onto another rocky outcrop, this one overlooking a fast-moving river. The path ended abruptly at the cliff's edge. "We're trapped," Mike gasped, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. The sound of splintering wood behind us announced Bigfoot's arrival. It emerged from the forest, its chest heaving, eyes blazing with murderous intent. Sarah's blood stained its matted fur, a grisly reminder of what awaited us if we were caught. I looked from the creature to the raging river below and back again, my mind racing. There was no way we could outrun it, no way we could fight it. We were cornered, with only one desperate option left. "We have to jump," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar of the river. Mike's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you crazy? We'll never survive that." "We won't survive this either," I countered, watching as Bigfoot took another menacing step forward. As the creature tensed, preparing to charge, I grabbed Mike's hand. "On 3, I said, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. 1, 2. Bigfoot roared, the sound reverberating through my very bones. It lunged forward, massive arms outstretched to grab us. 3, I screamed, leaping off the cliff and pulling Mike with me. For a moment, we were suspended in the air, Bigfoot's frustrated roar echoing above us. Then we plunged into the icy waters of the river, the current immediately sweeping us away from the monster on the cliff. As the rapids tossed us about, I caught one last glimpse of Bigfoot's massive form silhouetted against the sky. Its roar of rage followed us downstream, a chilling reminder that our ordeal was far from over. The river carried us away from immediate danger, but I knew we weren't safe yet. Somewhere in the forest, Bigfoot was still out there. and I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stop until it had finished what it started. As we struggled to keep our heads above water, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah's broken body from my mind. The guilt and horror of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me. But I pushed it down, focusing on survival. We had to make it out of this forest alive. We had to tell the world what was out there. The river swept us onwards, towards an uncertain future. But one thing was clear: our lives would never be the same again. The icy water of the river shocked my system, momentarily driving all thoughts from my mind except for one: survive. I gasped for air as the current tossed me about like a rag doll, my limbs flailing wildly as I tried to keep my head above water. "Mike," I sputtered, catching a glimpse of him a few yards away, equally struggling against the rapids. Stay with me." The roar of the water nearly drowned out my words, but I saw Mike nod, his face a mask of determination and fear. We were both experienced swimmers, but this was unlike anything we'd ever faced before. As we were swept downstream, I couldn't shake the image of BigFoot's enraged face from my mind. The creature's roar seemed to echo in my ears, even over the rush of the river. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I realized that our ordeal was far from over. "We need to get to shore," I yelled to Mike, my teeth chattering from the cold. He nodded again, and we both began to angle ourselves towards the riverbank. The current fought us every inch of the way, threatening to pull us under with each passing moment. My lungs burned, and my muscles screamed in protest, but the memory of Sarah's fate drove me on. We had to survive. We had to tell the world what happened. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my feet finally scraped against the rocky bottom of the river. With a final burst of energy, I lunged for the shore, my fingers digging into the muddy bank as I dragged myself out of the water. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my whole body trembling with exhaustion and cold. Beside me, I heard Mike crawl out of the river, coughing and sputtering. For a moment, we just lay there, too drained to move or speak. The forest around us seemed eerily quiet after the roar of the rapids, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice hoarse. "Emily, are you okay? Are you?" I turned my head to look at him, taking in his battered appearance. His clothes were torn, his face scratched and bruised. I imagined I looked no better. "I'm alive," I managed to croak out. "You?" He nodded weakly. "Yeah. But Emily. Sarah." The grief hit me like a physical blow, and I had to choke back a sob. "I know," I whispered. "I know." We lapsed into silence again, the weight of what we'd experienced pressing down on us. Sarah was gone, taken by a creature that shouldn't exist, and we were lost in the wilderness with no idea how to get back to civilization. After a few minutes, I forced myself to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice stronger now. "It might be following the river." Mike's eyes widened with fear, but he nodded, pushing himself to his feet. "You're right. We need to keep moving." I stood up, my legs shaky but holding. Looking around, I tried to get my bearings. The dense forest stretched out in all directions, offering no clues as to which way might lead us to safety. "Let's follow the river downstream," I suggested. "It has to lead somewhere, right?" Mike agreed, and we set off, our movements slow and pained. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig under our feet, made us flinch. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just yesterday now felt like a sinister maze, hiding untold dangers behind every tree. As we walked, I couldn't help but replay the events of the past day in my mind. The initial sighting, the disbelief of my friends, the horrifying chase through the woods, and Sarah's. I shuddered, unable to complete the thought. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Mike asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. I sighed, shaking my head. "I don't know, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Bigfoot attacking campers in Pennsylvania. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." "We have to try," Mike said, his voice filled with determination. "For Sarah. People need to know what's out there." I nodded, grateful for his resolve. It helped keep the crushing weight of fear and grief at bay, if only for a moment. We continued on, the forest growing denser as we moved away from the river. The underbrush tore at our already battered bodies, and more than once we had to stop to untangle ourselves from thorny vines. Suddenly I froze, my hand shooting out to stop Mike. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart racing. He shook his head, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We both stood perfectly still, straining our ears. There it was again, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It was distant, but unmistakable. Bigfoot's growl. "It's following us," I breathed, panic rising in my chest. Mike grabbed my hand. "Run," he said simply, and we took off. Adrenaline surged through my veins as we sprinted through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Every instinct screamed at me to look back, but I forced myself to keep my eyes forward. I knew that if I saw that massive, fur-covered form crashing through the trees behind us, I might lose what little courage I had left. We ran blindly, with no direction in mind other than away. Away from the monster that had already claimed one of our friends. Away from the nightmare that our peaceful camping trip had become. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, knowing that to slow down meant certain death. I could hear Mike's labored breathing beside me, punctuated by the sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps behind us. "There!" Mike gasped, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could see a break in the forest. Hope surged through me as we pushed towards it with renewed energy. We burst through the tree line onto a busy road, the sudden transition from wilderness to civilization so jarring that for a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. Cars screeched to a halt around us as we collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for air. I risked a glance back at the forest, half expecting to see Bigfoot emerge from the trees. But the woods were still, betraying no sign of the horror we'd just escaped. As people began to gather around us, their voices a confused jumble of concern and curiosity, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We'd made it. We'd escaped. But even as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, I knew our ordeal wasn't over. We were safe for now, but Bigfoot was still out there. And we had a story to tell. A story that no one was likely to believe. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, I looked at Mike, seeing my own mix of relief, grief, and determination mirrored in his eyes. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. We owed it to Sarah, and to ourselves, to make sure the truth came out. The forest loomed behind us, dark and foreboding. And somewhere in its depths, I knew, Bigfoot was waiting for its next victim, its next opportunity to strike. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, even as the warmth of the sun and the bustle of human activity surrounded us. Our escape was complete, but I had a feeling our journey was far from over. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed incessantly, their harsh glare making my eyes ache. I sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, a scratchy blanket draped over my shoulders, trying to stop my hands from shaking as I clutched a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. Beside me, Mike looked equally shell-shocked, his gaze distant and unfocused. We'd been here for hours, ever since the ambulance had brought us in from the roadside where we'd collapsed. The paramedics had treated our cuts and bruises, but they couldn't do anything for the bone-deep exhaustion and terror that still gripped us. A door opened, and Detective Ramirez walked in, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He'd been questioning us on and off since we arrived, his initial concern gradually giving way to skepticism as our story unfolded. "All right, Ms. Williams," he said, sitting down across from us. "Let's go over this one more time." I suppressed a sigh, knowing what was coming. "Of course, Detective. You claim that you and your friends were attacked in the woods by Bigfoot?" The doubt in his voice was palpable. "I know how it sounds," I said, my voice cracking. "But it's the truth. We saw it. It killed Sarah." Detective Ramirez's pen hesitated over his notepad at the mention of Sarah. "And you say this creature was, 8 feet tall? Covered in fur?" I nodded, the image of Bigfoot's terrifying form flashing in my mind. "Yes, It was massive with long arms and these eyes. They were so intelligent, but filled with rage. The detective's eyebrows rose slightly. Intelligent eyes on a giant furry monster? It's true, Mike interjected, his voice hoarse. We all saw it. It tore through Emily's tent like it was paper. And when it got Sarah, he trailed off, unable to continue. I could see the doubt in Detective Ramirez's eyes as he took notes, his pen hesitating over words like Bigfoot and monster. The weight of their disbelief pressed down on me, threatening to crush what little resolve I had left. Look, I said, leaning forward. I know it sounds crazy. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But it's real. It's out there. And it's dangerous. Detective Ramirez sighed, setting down his pen. Ms. Williams, Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but you have to understand how this sounds. Bigfoot doesn't exist. It's a myth, a legend. But Sarah, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. We have search parties combing the area where you say this incident occurred. So far, they've found no sign of your friend or any large unknown animal. My heart sank. Of course, there wouldn't be any evidence. Bigfoot had disappeared into the forest, taking any proof of its existence with it. What about our injuries? Mike asked, gesturing to the cuts and bruises that covered both of us. The state of our clothes? We didn't do this to ourselves. Detective Ramirez nodded. You've clearly been through something. But there are many dangers in the forest. Bears, mountain lions, even just the terrain itself. It's easy for the mind to play tricks when you're scared and in unfamiliar surroundings. I felt a surge of frustration. We know what we saw. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was Bigfoot. The detective's face softened slightly. Ms. Williams, I can see you believe what you're saying, but without any evidence, us. So you think we're lying? I asked, my voice rising. That we made this all up? That Sarah is just, what, hiding somewhere as a joke? No one's accusing you of lying, Detective Ramirez said calmly. But trauma can affect memory, perception. It's possible that in your fear and confusion, your minds created an explanation that made sense to you at the time. I slumped back in my chair, feeling utterly defeated. How could I make them understand? How could I convey the terror of seeing Bigfoot's massive form emerging from the shadows, of hearing its bone-chilling roar, of watching it toss Sarah aside like she was nothing? What happens now? Mike asked quietly. Detective Ramirez stood up, tucking his notepad into his pocket. We'll continue the search for Sarah. In the meantime, I suggest you both get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow when you've had a chance to process everything. As he turned to leave, I made one last, desperate attempt. Please, I said, my voice cracking. You have to believe us. There's a monster out there. People need to be warned. The detective paused at the door, his expression a mix of pity and exasperation. Ms. Williams, I understand you're upset, but spreading stories about Bigfoot attacks will only cause panic. Let us handle the investigation. With that, he left, the door closing behind him with a final sounding click. Mike and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. We were the only ones who knew the truth, but no one would believe us. What do we do now? Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, feeling utterly lost. I don't know. How can we just go back to our normal lives after this, knowing what's out there? A young officer appeared at the door. Mr. Thompson, Ms. Williams, you're free to go. Is there someone we can call to pick you up? We nodded numbly, giving him the contact information for Mike's parents who lived in the nearby town. As we waited in the lobby, I couldn't help but feel like we were abandoning Sarah by leaving. But what choice did we have? Mike's parents arrived, their faces etched with worry. As we walked out of the police station into the cool night air, I felt utterly alone. The truth of what happened burned inside me. with no one to believe it. I looked back at the station, then out towards the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. Somewhere out there, BigFoot was still roaming free, and we were the only ones who knew the danger it posed. As we drove away, leaving the forest and its horrors behind, I knew that this was far from over. The memory of what we'd experienced would haunt us forever, and the knowledge that BigFoot was real, that it was out there, would be a burden we'd have to carry alone. The world around us seemed unchanged, people going about their lives oblivious to the terror that lurked in the woods. But for Mike and me, everything had shifted. We had seen the impossible, faced a monster straight out of legend, and lived to tell the tale. But as the lights of the town faded behind us and the dark expanse of the forest loomed in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with BigFoot was just the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story. The early morning mist clung to the trees as we made our way back into the forest. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run in the opposite direction, here I was, leading a search party into the very heart of the nightmare we had just escaped. The weight of Sarah's absence hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of why we had to do this. Detective Ramirez walked beside me, his face set in a grim expression. He had been skeptical of our story, but the disappearance of Sarah was something he couldn't ignore. Behind us, a team of local police officers and volunteers spread out in a line, their eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of our missing friend. "Ms. Williams," Ramirez said, his voice low, "I need you to understand something. We're here to find Sarah, not to hunt for, well, you know." I nodded, biting back the urge to argue. "I understand, Detective, but please, keep an open mind. What we saw was real." He sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Let's just focus on the search, all right?" As we pushed deeper into the woods, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. My eyes darted constantly between the trees, half expecting to see that massive fur-covered form emerge at any moment. The forest seemed to close in around us, the very air thick with tension. "Over here!" a voice called out suddenly. My heart leaped into my throat as we rushed towards the sound. One of the volunteers was pointing at something on the ground. As we got closer, I saw what had caught his attention. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorny bush. My breath caught as I recognized it. A piece of Sarah's jacket. "This is," I started, my voice trembling. "Evidence," Detective Ramirez finished, his tone professional but tinged with concern. He carefully bagged the fabric, then turned to me. "Can you tell which direction she might have been heading?" I looked around, trying to orient myself. Everything looked different in the daylight without the haze of terror that had clouded my perception during our escape. But then I spotted a familiar rock formation. "That way," I said, pointing, "towards the ravine where we last saw her." The detective nodded, signaling the team to move in that direction. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapped twig made me flinch, my eyes constantly darting between the trees, expecting to see those glowing eyes again. We reached the edge of the ravine, and I had to fight back a wave of nausea as memories of that terrible moment flooded back. The search team spread out, carefully making their way down the steep slope. "Emily," Mike's voice came from beside me. He had insisted on joining the search despite his parents' objections. Do you think we'll find her?" I looked at him, seeing the hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I don't know, Mike, but we have to try." As we descended into the ravine, the murmurs of the search team felt like accusations, their sidelong glances making it clear they thought we were somehow responsible for Sarah's disappearance. I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on scanning the ground for any sign of our friend. Suddenly, one of the officers called out, "I've got something." We rushed over, hope and dread battling in my chest. The officer was pointing at a disturbed area of ground, where the leaves and dirt had been scraped away as if something, or someone, had been dragged. "Could be animal activity," one of the other searchers suggested. I shook my head vehemently. "No, This was Bigfoot. This is where Sarah... I couldn't finish the sentence, but Detective Ramirez was already kneeling down, examining the area closely. There's definitely signs of a struggle here, he admitted. But let's not jump to conclusions. As the team continued to search the area, I found myself drawn to a nearby cluster of trees. Something about them seemed off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. As I got closer, I realized what had caught my attention. Long, deep gouges in the bark, far too high up to have been made by any normal animal. "Detective," I called out, my voice shaking. "You need to see this." Ramirez came over, his eyebrows furrowing as he saw the marks. "What could have done this?" he muttered, almost to himself. "I told you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was Bigfoot. These marks are exactly at the height where its arms would be." The detective ran his hand over the gouges, his expression troubled. "This is unusual," he admitted, "but it doesn't prove anything about a mythical creature." As night began to fall and the search was called off for the day, the weight of guilt and fear threatened to crush me. We had found signs of Sarah's presence, signs of a struggle, but no concrete evidence of what had taken her, and certainly nothing that would convince the skeptics of what we had really encountered. Back at the base camp set up at the edge of the forest, I overheard snippets of conversation from the search team. "Probably just ran off. Could have fallen and hit her head. Those kids are hiding something." I couldn't shake the feeling that Bigfoot was out there, watching and waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The forest loomed dark and forbidding as the last light faded from the sky, hiding its secrets in impenetrable shadows. Detective Ramirez approached me as I sat staring into the tree line. "Ms. Williams, we'll resume the search tomorrow at first light. You should get some rest." I nodded numbly, knowing sleep would be impossible. As the detective turned to leave, I called out to him. "You believe us now, don't you, about what we saw?" He paused, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I believe something happened out there," he said carefully. "But Bigfoot? That's a big leap, Emily. We'll keep looking for Sarah and for answers. That's all I can promise right now." As he walked away, I felt utterly alone. The truth of what happened burned inside me, with no one to fully believe it. I looked out at the forest once more, knowing that somewhere in its depths, Bigfoot was still out there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with the creature was far from over. The night stretched out before us, long and full of terrors both real and imagined. And somewhere in the darkness I knew, the search for Sarah, and for the truth, was only just beginning. Sleep eluded me in the days that followed our harrowing escape from the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bigfoot's terrifying form, its glowing eyes filled with primal rage. The memory of Sarah's scream echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the friend we had lost and the horror we had witnessed. It had been 3 days since we emerged from the woods, battered and traumatized. The search for Sarah continued, but hope was fading with each passing hour. Mike and I had been questioned repeatedly by the police, but our story remained the same, a story that no one seemed willing to believe. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window at the tree line in the distance. The forest that had once seemed so inviting now loomed like a malevolent presence on the horizon. Somewhere in those woods, Bigfoot was still out there, waiting. A soft knock on my door startled me from my thoughts. "Emily?" My mother's voice called gently. "There's someone here to see you." I opened the door to find Detective Ramirez standing in the hallway, his face grim. "Ms. Williams," he said. "I was hoping we could talk." We moved to the living room where Mike was already waiting, looking as haggard and sleep-deprived as I felt. Detective Ramirez sat across from us, his notepad in hand. "I know this has been difficult for both of you," he began, his tone softer than in our previous interactions. "But we need to go over your story one more time. There are some inconsistencies we need to clear up." I felt a flash of anger. "Inconsistencies? We've told you everything exactly as it happened." What more do you want from us? The detective held up a placating hand. I understand your frustration, but you have to see this from our perspective. Your story about a Bigfoot attack, and it's unprecedented. We need to explore all possibilities. Mike leaned forward, his voice strained. What about the evidence we found during the search? The claw marks on the trees, the signs of a struggle? We're analyzing everything, Ramirez assured us. But so far there's nothing conclusive, nothing that points definitively to an unknown creature. I stood up abruptly, unable to contain my frustration any longer. So what, you think we imagined it all? That we did something to Sarah? The detective's expression remained neutral. No one's accusing you of anything, Emily. We're just trying to understand what happened out there. As Ramirez continued to question us, I found myself drawn to the window. The forest seemed to be calling to me, holding the answers we so desperately needed. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket. Emily? Mike's concerned voice broke through my daze. What are you doing? I need to go back, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to find proof. Detective Ramirez stood up quickly. Ms. Williams, I can't allow you to interfere with an ongoing investigation. It's not safe for you to return to the forest alone. But I was already heading for the door, driven by a desperate need to validate our experience, to prove that we weren't crazy. Mike caught up to me on the porch, grabbing my arm. Emily, stop! You can't go back there. It's too dangerous. I turned to face him, seeing the fear and concern in his eyes. Don't you see, Mike? No one believes us. If we don't find proof, Sarah's death will have been for nothing. That thing will still be out there, and no one will know the truth. For a moment I thought he might try to stop me, but then his expression hardened with resolve. Okay, he said, but I'm coming with you. Before Detective Ramirez could intervene, we were in my car speeding towards the forest. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was a terrible idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was our last chance to uncover the truth. As we approached the trailhead where our nightmare had begun, a chill ran down my spine. The forest loomed before us, dark and foreboding. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the car door. We don't have to do this, Mike said softly. We can turn back. I shook my head. No, we need to finish this, for Sarah. We stepped out of the car, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filling my nostrils. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But we pressed on, following the trail that led into the heart of Bigfoot's domain. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. We reached the clearing where we had first encountered Bigfoot. The area was now marked off with police tape, but otherwise it looked eerily unchanged. I knelt down, examining the ground for any sign of the creature's massive footprints. Emily. Mike's voice was tense. Do you hear that? I froze, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then faintly I caught it, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. Bigfoot's growl. It's here, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's still here. Mike grabbed my hand. We need to go. Now. But before we could move, a distant roar shook the forest. It was the same bone-chilling sound we had heard on that terrible night, a sound that would haunt my nightmares forever. We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the noise we were making. Behind us I could hear the sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps. Bigfoot was in pursuit. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, knowing that to slow down meant certain death. I could hear Mike's labored breathing beside me, punctuated by the terrifying sounds of our pursuer gaining ground. Just as I thought my legs would give out, we burst through the tree line onto the road where we had parked. Cars screeched to a halt around us as we collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for air. I risked a glance back at the forest, half expecting to see Bigfoot emerge from the trees. But the woods were still, betraying no sign of the horror we'd just escaped. As a crowd began to gather, their voices a confused jumble of concern and curiosity, I felt a wave of déjà vu wash over me. We were back where we started with no proof and no one to believe our story. Detective Ramirez's car pulled up, sirens blaring. As he approached us, his face a mix of anger and relief, I knew we were in for another round of questioning, another battle to make someone believe the truth. But as I looked at the forest, a distant roar sent chills down my spine, confirming my worst fears. Bigfoot was still out there. And now, more than ever, I was determined to make the world believe our story, no matter what it took. Weeks had passed since our terrifying encounter in the Pennsylvania forest, but the memory remained as vivid as ever, haunting my every waking moment. I sat at my desk, staring out the window at the trees lining the edge of our small town. Even from this distance, the sight of the forest made my heart race. The local news played softly in the background, a constant reminder of how our lives had been turned upside down. The search for missing hiker Sarah Johnson has been officially called off, the anchor announced, her voice devoid of emotion. Local authorities state that while the investigation remains open, they have exhausted all leads. I turned away from the TV, unable to bear the weight of those words. Sarah was gone, taken by a creature that the world refused to believe existed, and Mike and I were left to carry the burden of that knowledge alone. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. It was Mike, his face haggard and drawn. "Hey, Em," he said softly. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged, not trusting my voice. Mike understood. He was going through the same thing. We'd become pariahs in our small Pennsylvania town known as the Kids Who Cried Bigfoot. People whispered behind our backs, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and suspicion. "I saw this online," Mike said, handing me a printout. "Thought you might be interested." I scanned the page, my heart skipping a beat. It was a news report about a group of hikers who had gone missing in a forest about 100 miles from where we had our encounter. The article mentioned unexplained animal attacks and strange footprints. "You don't think—" I started, looking up at Mike. He nodded grimly. "It sounds too similar to be a coincidence, doesn't it?" I felt a chill run down my spine. If this was true, if Bigfoot was still out there attacking people, then our nightmare was far from over. We had a responsibility to warn others, to prevent more tragedies like what happened to Sarah. "We have to do something," I said, standing up. "We can't let this happen to anyone else." Mike looked uncertain. "But Em, no one believes us. We've tried telling the police, the rangers, even the media. They all think we're either crazy or lying." He was right, of course. Every attempt we'd made to share our story had been met with skepticism at best, and outright ridicule at worst. The local paper had painted us as attention-seeking teenagers, while online forums were filled with people calling us hoaxers or delusional. "There has to be a way," I insisted. "Someone out there must believe in Bigfoot, right? Maybe we can find others who've had similar experiences." We spent the next few hours scouring the internet, searching for any credible reports of Bigfoot sightings or attacks. Most of what we found was clearly fake or exaggerated, but a few accounts stood out as eerily similar to our own experience. As night fell, I found myself standing at my window, staring out at the forest. The memory of Bigfoot's glowing eyes and bone-chilling roar was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the creature was waiting, watching. "Emily?" My mom's voice called from downstairs. "There's someone here to see you." Curious, I headed down to find a man in his mid-50s standing in our living room. He introduced himself as Dr. Alan Forrester, a cryptozoologist from a nearby university. "I've been following your story," he said, his eyes alight with interest. "And I believe you." For a moment, I was speechless. After weeks of disbelief and dismissal, here was someone who actually wanted to listen. Dr. Forrester explained that he had been studying Bigfoot legends for years, and our account was one of the most detailed and credible he had ever come across. "I'd like to interview you and Mike," he said. "Document your experience in detail. It could be crucial in proving the existence of Bigfoot." Part of me was elated at the chance to finally be heard, to have our story taken seriously. But another part, the part that still woke up screaming from nightmares of that terrible night, was hesitant. "What good will it do?" I asked. "Even if you believe us, the rest of the world won't." Dr. Forrester leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It's a start, Emily. Your testimony, combined with other evidence I've gathered over the years, could be the key to proving Bigfoot's existence once and for all. And if we can do that, we can protect others from experiencing what you went through." I thought about Sarah, about the hikers in the recent news report. If there was even a chance we could prevent more attacks, didn't we have an obligation to try? "Okay," I said finally. "I'll do it. But I need to talk to Mike first." As Dr. Forrester left, promising to return the next day to begin the interviews, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Hope that someone finally believed us. Fear at the prospect of reliving that terrifying experience. And underneath it all, a grim determination to see this through, no matter what. I called Mike, filling him in on Dr. Forrester's visit. He was cautiously optimistic, agreeing to participate in the interviews. As we talked, I found myself gazing out at the forest once more. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, looking deceptively peaceful. But I knew better now. Somewhere out there, Bigfoot was waiting. And as long as it remained hidden, as long as people refused to believe in its existence, no one was safe. As I hung up the phone, I made a silent vow. We would tell our story, no matter how many times it took. We would make people believe, make them understand the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. Because somewhere out there, Bigfoot was waiting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The memory of that night would never leave me, the image of Bigfoot's terrifying form forever etched in my mind. But now, perhaps it could serve a purpose. If our story could save even one person from experiencing the horror we had faced, then maybe, just maybe, it would all be worth it. As night fell and the forest faded into darkness, I steeled myself for what was to come. Our encounter with Bigfoot had changed us forever, but the real battle, the battle to make the world believe, was only just beginning.